Howdy, y'all. So, we've been trying to set this discussion up for like probably weeks now, and had a few hiccups with phones and stuff like that. And but we've had this discussion for like back and forth for a while now about how compatible is like Christianity, generically, and libertarianism. How compatible are these actually? And tonight, I'm going to be kind of making the case to Jacob here about the compatibility is, if they're really not, when you get into it, like in terms of what they actually think rights consist of. Because it's one thing to say, how are we enforcing, rights and wrong? And I readily agree there's a lot of overlap there. But to actually say, well, what do these rights that we're enforcing actually consist of? It's like, that's where I think the real incompatibility lies.
Andrew's trying to get me to this by the end of the night, this name change.
I know. It's like, it's going to get biblical monarchy, here we come. So all right, let's go ahead and I made a short little presentation. I'm, fair warning, I'm going to be flying through some, really, really in-depth philosophical concepts that normally are like a 2-hour discussion all by themselves. So I'm going to be condensing them into about 10 minutes. So it's if it feels like I'm going really fast and I'm not explaining everything, it's because I'm not. And if you want to get a really full understanding of what nominalism is, or subjectivism, or these other isms that I'm going to be throwing around, we're going to put some links in the description to two very excellent podcasts by the SSPX, church I go to, and that explain what these philosophies actually are, where they come from, how they play into history, where we see them today. And because once you kind of understand what nominalism is, you can't not see it. You will see it everywhere. I mean, it is like all the basket case craziness of the left is 100% nominalism. You can't not see it afterwards. The problem is this philosophy and others is also present in libertarianism, which is going to cause big problems and big inconsistencies where this cannot be reconciled with Christianity. So let's go ahead and start that. We're going to have Jacob record this because I forgot to renew my subscription to StreamYard. Whoopsie. So
I'm the capitalist in this enterprise, so I do have ultimate control.
That's right, he does. So let me start this up. There we go. So let's start with the obvious question is, well, framing Christianity. I'm going to do this by framing Christianity first, and then I'm going to frame libertarianism, and then we're going to talk about that. So the first thing is forget who is God, what is God is a much more important question to this discussion. And the first thing that a lot of probably early not early Christians, but young Christians who are not very well educated in the faith, and a lot of atheists get completely wrong, is that God is not like some super being, like Zeus or Thor, and it's this is like a common straw man that that atheists will try to use when they're debating with Protestants who don't really know the philosophy. And the what God actually is the source of being itself. Now, being is a metaphysics term that comes from the ancient Greece, where it's like, okay, what actually exists? To have a being of something is to actually exist. That's that's in ontology. That is the question of what actually exists and what doesn't. And being is like the most fundamental characteristic of existence. So if you don't have a being, you don't exist. And God is the source of this. And you actually see this in the Bible. Like when he, God is, he is the answer to the question to, what does it mean to be, that like he is being of being, is the essence of essence, the source of all things. And you actually see this in the Bible where he will identify personally as this when he says, what's my name? I am.
Right. And in the Hebrew, that actually is more accurately translated as I am being.
Yeah.
when you look at it. So
yep, pretty much. And it's like it's in the name. He is, he is being itself. And when you actually see like the early Christian saints, like the fathers of the church, like Irenaeus, Origen, Augustine, the Cappadocian fathers, Nicaea, the first council of Nicaea, which, by the way, if you don't agree with, you're not a Christian. Yeah, so just
I copyrighted that.
But something people have said for a long time, but yeah. Anyway, because copyrights don't exist.
yeah, exactly.
Anyway, but yeah, it's like when you look at the early Christians, to a man, every last one of them is talking about God as like the source of being itself, not as like a super being. And by super being, I mean like an uber powerful, person, entity that just inhabits the rest of reality. But it itself is not the creator of reality. It is not the ultimate source of reality. So that's what a super being is, and that's different from what we're actually talking about with God. And so so why is that important? Well, first let's back up to classical Greece. See, a lot of you think, well, why are we going all the way? If we're talking about Christianity, why are we talking about these pagans who lived like 300 to 600 years before Christ? Well, it's actually really interesting because they, through sheer logic and reason, they figured out quite a lot about God. Yeah, like the actual one, not the Greek gods. And what you'll see that them making statements like they had figured out that like the Greek gods, like Zeus and Thor, these who are actually like fallen angels. When St. Paul in I think it's Ephesians, I want to say, he says, hey, our battle is with powers and principalities and stuff like that. Yeah, that's these guys. Yeah, like Zeus, Thor, Atum, Quetzalcoatl, all that. Like those guys are fallen angels. Yeah, all of them. And they're like powers and principalities. They are here to guide human rulers in how to behave and how to actually rule wisely. And they decided that actually we prefer to have our self worship instead. So
there's also the the monument to the unknown god in Athens that Paul talks about. So yeah, I mean the Greeks were kind of like, they knew there was something beyond their shit show made up gods.
Oh, they actually go much further than that. It's like they actually say that you'll see like Aristotle. He says like the essence of goodness, which is transcendental in its nature, is actually greater than all the Greek gods. You'll see like with guys like Heraclitus, that like the logos is like that is the source of logic, rationality. It means word, but the way it's actually used amongst the Stoic philosophers is this is like some sort of animating force. We're not quite sure where it exists, why it exists or where it came from or what it actually is, but it's some sort of logical force that seems to permeate reality and seems to be somehow completely interrelated to all of it. And so and it is transcendental in nature. So it's like they had gotten to the point of, we're starting to define real characteristics of this source of being itself, and they figured out that it was transcendental. They figured out that like the Greek gods are not the real, they're not like the source of being itself. They figured all this stuff out, and they just put actually, let me back up. So they were starting with when you're starting with Greek philosophy, you have to start with like kind of Plato and what's called Platonic realism. That is this idea that the form of goodness actually is a real thing. It's not just like what we're calling something. This is actually like an abstract object. It really does exist and has a causal effect on reality. So whether something is good or evil, is going to have a cause. You will see a causal effect because of it. So it's like if a action is good, its effect will be causally good. And you can actually see that there's a deterministic quality to it. It's not just something I'm subjectively applying or not. And so, when you have like an instantiation of what's called partaking of a form, you have like the form of a triangle, which is like the definition. And then you have like an actual triangle in reality. And that actual triangle in reality is partaking of this universal form that really does exist and actually really does have real properties. And so the common examples are like logic itself, goodness itself, geometry, and the numbers is like a real thing. Like, are numbers real? So it's not like the word, for like two. Is there actually a to or dos. It doesn't matter the what language you're calling it in, but like this concept that those words refer to itself is a real thing. It's a real abstract property that makes a big difference, and it actually has a real, like mathematics has a real causal effect on reality, and it's not just something we made up. You know what I mean? And so this is what's called Platonic realism, and trust me, this is important. This is like the core of the argument against libertarianism, because libertarianism rejects this. So let's move on. So what's the problem? So you got one small epistemological problem that this is something actually we both agree that both a libertarian and a Christian can agree on, is that in order for any belief system to be true, it must be derived from a first principle, and logic itself is not that. So logos is kind of a problem, because due to its transcendent nature, the logos is completely unknowable, short of revelation. So it's like, in order, like the entire concept is, it might be true, but it's basically useless, because the logos is basically going to have to reveal itself in order to tell you real qualities about itself. It's like, we don't even know if it is actually an it. Like, is it a person? Is it like conscious? Does it have a mind? Is it just like an unthinking force of nature, like gravity? Or, is it I should say electromagnetism. But like, is it a person? Is it the creator of all things? Or is it just like kind of related to him, her, it, them? Who knows? It's like,
only there was a passage that got into what the logos was, and
it's like, maybe or maybe like it doesn't exist at all. Maybe like the Epicurean philosophers would talk to to the Stoics about this, because the Stoic philosophers are the ones who are like really honing in on this logos concept and really refining it. The Epicureans are like your hedonists, and they're like the ones who are like, I don't really want to. All of that logic stuff seems to be a restraint on me. I don't really like that. So it's like, prove it. Where does it come from? I don't see it. I don't see any logos. Do you see it? Nope, me neither. And it's like, I think maybe you Stoics are just seeing a face in the clouds, and you're seeing a pattern that isn't actually there. Maybe there isn't an actual order or a logic or rationality to the universe. How do you actually know that this logos, this transcendental logic, etc., is real? How do you know? And well, actually, we do. It's like, this is why. This is what's found. This is John chapter 1. This is the foundation of Christianity. This is when so like when John's starting out his gospel, there's no like leap of faith here. He's saying, here's exactly what we believe and why we believe it and why it's important. And he's basically this epistemological problem, that the Greeks had like figured out, is like, they know it's a problem. They can't prove this thing, that they can see it, they can see its effects, but they can't tell where it is, what it is, or where it comes from. And so, when the word became flesh and dwelt among us, it's like, all of a sudden, all right, problem solved. Now we know, now we can move forward. And so, I'll just read this, that John chapter 1, in the beginning was the word. That then here, word is logos. So I'm going to read this as, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. And remember, we're saying the source of being. When we say God, we are saying the source of being itself. And so we're not saying a super being, we are saying the source of existence. And so, he was so a logos is actually a person, and has a masculine type to it. We didn't know that before. Now we do. And so the logos was in the beginning with God. And most importantly, all things came into being through him, that being the logos, and without him, not one thing came into being. So in other words, not only is the logos one with the source of being, it is like all things that exist came into being through him. So, and without him, nothing exists. And so, but how do we, like, cool story, bro. How do we know? It's like, well, he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. So it's now recognizing that there was an epistemological problem here, that this logos actually is the creator of heaven and earth and all things. But, but why is it we don't know that? It's like, he's acknowledging the problem. So, like, what do we do about that? He says, the word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's only son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This is the one whom I said, he is the one who comes after me, and ranks ahead of me because he was before me." And and no one has ever seen God. It is God the only Son who is close to the Father's heart and who has made him known. So in other words, this is solving both the metaphysical problem. Remember, we have it is useless as a first. Logos itself is useless, entirely useless as a first principle, unless you can give it specific defining characteristics, which you could not do through sheer logic. That this was like the big brick wall that Stoics hit, that they were not able to get past. And so the Jews come along and solve this thing, and said, actually, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And this is how we know the actual characteristics of logos. Turns out it is a person. It is masculine in at least analogously masculine. And it actually cares quite a lot about morality. It's not an unthinking force. It cares quite a lot about morality. It has real purpose in itself, that being itself. And it has all of these extra characteristics that now we can actually move forward. And so why is this important? Well, when the Logos came to earth, it left behind a church founded on the authority of his apostles that he promised to protect from teaching error. That's Matthew 16:18. "You are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And he says, go unto all the earth, baptizing people in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he's actually building a church and promising to protect it from error. So so you might be thinking to yourself now, so wait, why do so many modern Christians say we need a leap of faith to believe in God if the Logos really did come to earth, and this is not like a question of belief, it's a question of history. It's like nobody asked, do you believe in Alexander the Great, who supposedly conquered, by the way, there's way more evidence for Jesus than there is for Alexander the Great. We got like a few coins and like a really, really torn up history of Alexander. But, for what we do know, supposedly he was a son of Zeus. People don't actually know that. Just like Philip of Macedon was not his actual father. It's like that they, probably really was, but you don't know. But in the actual records, he's actually, according to his mother, who was a witch of the, she was a priestess, witch of the goddess. I'm forgetting her name. It was the goddess of witchcraft, Hecate. There we go, Hecate. His mother was a priestess of the goddess of witchcraft named Hecate, and she said, nope, actually, Philip of Macedon is not his father. It's actually Zeus. And and when he goes to Egypt, there's another Egyptian priest like, Philip was not your father. It was like Zeus, or Atum, I think, is the corresponding name in in Egyptian mythology, just same entity. Anyway, and this guy conquered like half a planet basically. And remember a story of Genesis with like Nephilim and all that. They were half angel hybrids. They were mighty warriors and they conquered shit and were like bloodthirsty beasts. And it's like he kind of fits the pattern. And so anyway, it's like, do you really believe it? Like, now that you know that, do you really believe in it? So some extra reason for skepticism there, but it's a matter of history. This is not like a matter of like religious, but of maybe I feel it is, or I feel it isn't. And it's like, it's not a matter of feeling, it's a matter of history. This thing did or didn't happen. This guy was or wasn't real. And this, same thing with like Jesus. Like he either either the Logos really did become flesh and dwell among us, and we witnessed his glory, and he also left behind a church that he promised to protect from error, founded upon the teaching authority of his apostles, or he didn't. It's like it's one of the two. And so where does this idea that Christians say we need a leap of faith to believe in God come from? The answer is Immanuel Kant, and we will get to him. So. But here's why this is actually really, really practically important is that, remember he said that all things came into being through him. Let's go back to that right there. That, in other words, all things that exist, came into being through him. Well, there's two things that definitely didn't, and those would be sin and error. So what is sin? That is, so what are these are actually, these are categories of actions. Sin is when my will refuses to partake of God. Remember, we said that these, we have Platonic realism, which is, that these instantiations of, are partaking of a certain abstract quality like goodness, that sin is I am, and all of these are kind of transcendentally locked in with God. So sin is my will, refusing to partake of God, of goodness. That's what that actually is. So in other words, sin is non-existent. When I am sinning, that is an act of momentary non-existence of my will, basically, because that is what's free about will, is that it's free to not exist. It's like that, whereas other things, it's like you're kind of locked in. You have to exist. You're free. Your will, on the other hand, is free not to. And error is kind of the same way, where your intellect is, your mind doesn't have to partake of logos. It is also free. That it does not have to always be completely 100% connected to, to God and to the logos, to logic itself. And whereas God punishes the first one, he doesn't seem to mind the second one for reasons I'm not quite clear on yet, because I haven't gotten that far in my study, but not relevant. So, but however, we say that, all human action exists. Actually, no. Some human actions actually don't exist because they don't partake of these abstract qualities of goodness and rationality. And this is why. And so now we have, for the first time ever, when we know the logos became flesh and it is the creator and all things came into being through it, we know how we have two categories of human actions that don't exist, and we know why we know why they don't have good results, because they don't partake of rationality or they don't partake of goodness. So, and because remember the law of causality, that effects will always mirror their causes. Well, because of this, okay, this one action that does not partake of goodness, therefore it's not going to bear good fruit. Because causality works that way. And Christ actually says this, kind of straight up. He says, "Hey, good trees bear good fruit." This is why. That's why it's the law of causality at work. And so and we know from Genesis that all that exists is good. When God said, and it's all rightly ordered to God. He said he created everything. He looked at it. He said, "This is good." And so, what we see is that evil isn't actually a substance. It's kind of just like darkness. There's no actual substance called darkness. It's just an absence of light. Light actually does have a substance called like photons, and photons actually are real. But whereas darkness only exists as an absence of photons. So darkness itself doesn't actually exist. And that's kind of the point that John chapter 1 is also making, is that in that light and dark imagery, it's saying, hey, light actually exists, and it is the life of the world. Whereas darkness doesn't actually exist. Darkness did not come into being through God, through the logos. And so this, by the way, this is also related to like Gnosticism and Star Wars, that have these dual, kind of dualist moralities, where there's a good God and a bad God, or there's like a good side to the Force, or there's a dark side to the Force. Why is this wrong? Well, this is, because one of these doesn't actually have an existence. One of them is just an absence of the other. And so there are not two fundamental substances to the two fundamental essences to the to the universe. There's just one, and that would be God. The source of being, the single lone source of being. So, so like as I was saying before, basically sin is willful non-being. Doesn't actually exist. It's just an absence of goodness, and so it's partaking of an absence of being. Ditto error is a non-partaking of rationality. So and by extension, free will, free intellect. These are the will and the intellect choosing not to exist, basically. And so like connecting a few Christian dots here for people who are kind of following along. So why is it that the wages of sin is death, non-existence? It's because the law of causality, non-existence begets non-existence. That's why, and these things accumulate. That's what that is. So this is why you can logically say that sin begets death, begets non-existence, begets slavery, which is an absence of choice. It's like that, because these things exist only as absences, And the more you compound these absences, well, the less you exist, the less you can choose, the sicker, sickness is an absence of health, et cetera, et cetera. You see the,
This is
and
why
so,
there's that really dumb atheist meme where Jesus is
mhm.
like, knock, knock, and they're like, who's there? It's like, me, I'm here to save you. And they go, save you from what? I'm here to save you from the punishment that I was going to give to you, and now I have to die to save you from. It's like, well, no, that hell
Yeah,
isn't
done.
a punishment. Hell is the natural consequence of sin. Death
Yeah,
is the natural consequence of sin. Like, in God being a God of order, it's like things are ordered in a certain way, and if we sin, there are consequences for that. So Jesus had to die to reconcile us to him, to save us from our sin. It's like, it's not
exactly.
it's completely sensical.
Yeah, it's like you're choosing non-existence, and he's trying to
Right.
save you basically from your own choices.
Right.
And it's so the
And thank God for that. Like, thank God he's loving and merciful, that like he doesn't just like, because he'd be well within his rights to be like, okay, you're choosing non-existence, bye. But like, no, he loves us and he chose to
it's like all
intercede
that
on our
exists is
behalf.
just because of me, and it's held in
Yeah.
existence because of me. If
Yeah.
you and like you don't have to, but there's literally nothing else to choose.
Yeah.
It's like, but you can choose nothing. So anyway, it's like, is it just me, or have atheists just gotten really stupid in the last 20 years? I see, like, I don't know. I remember back in the 90s, they seemed to be a lot more impressive when I was 8 and 9, than they are now. Just seem like really dumb these days. They don't know anything about what Christians actually believe. Whereas like atheists in the 90s, like they actually like had
they
some
they
familiarity.
pick the low-hanging fruit. Like, it's easy to
Yeah,
go after the worst of the Protestant evangelical church that isn't steeped in church history, that isn't steeped in philosophy
yeah,
and deep theology. Their theology is basically like, oh, the Bible says what I want it to say.
yeah. It's like those guys. And
Yeah.
they're the guys who don't actually know that God is the source of being, not a super being. And so it's like, when the atheists are kind of straw manning God as like, like he's Zeus or Thor, it's like, yeah, actually that thing doesn't actually, that's not what we're talking about. They don't even know what we're talking about.
Yep.
And so had like one atheist the other day arguing with me on Twitter. He's like, I don't see what God would have to do with morality at all. He's just off in the distance somewhere. He's just like some super being like Thor. Well, what does he have to do with reality? Reality is actually, and then he comes back at me with, actually morality is based off of transcendental logic. I'm like, well, where'd you get that? You mean logos? Really? You don't say. He's like, I got that because I believe I listen to Hoppe. I'm like, that's not what Hoppe says. And we're gonna get there. But so
Q-tip,
now let's
stop. The Q-tip needs to stop when you hit resistance.
exactly. So anyway, let's frame libertarianism now. And so remember we said this Platonic realism of, these forms, these abstract objects that we are partaking of or not partaking of, that is intrinsic to like Christian morality and Christianity itself. There's an opposite, its opposite, ideology is called nominalism. And it came around kind of in the 1300s, through some monks in England, I think, who were very misguided. And anyway, but what nominalism holds is that, when I am, like when I say it says that all these things, these abstract properties, like, like logic, goodness, morality, things like natures, like they don't actually exist. These are just names or titles that man is subjectively applying, to things outside of himself. So what it's doing is it's a reversal of, of object and subject. So basically says everything, like all of existence is subjective. This is, I don't know the actual thing. I'm just, all I have is my experience of the thing. And then in order to understand this, I'm, from within myself, from within my intellect, I am applying a framework to this thing that I'm going to call that logical, or I'm going to call this, moral, or I'm going to call this ethical, or I'm going to call this mathematical. And you can start to see how this is going to go very, very wrong very quickly.
This is how we get to what is a woman? Well, it's a person who identifies as a woman.
Yeah, because based on my experience of this, a woman can easily have a penis. This is where that goes. Now, granted, the 13th century monks were not thinking like this. They didn't think it all the way through. But now, like when you start to see that this idea that these properties of like goodness or rationality or whatever, that these are not actual real things that have a causal impact on reality. They're just names that humans apply to some things and not others. You can quickly see why the left is actually being fairly logically consistent when they say math is racist. And, rationality is just like a social construct of the white, cis, hetero Christian male patriarchy. It's like, this is actually where that comes from. This is actually a real rational system. They're the rational ones. I should say, they're not the rational ones. They're the logically consistent ones. Whereas like you start getting to like conservatism or libertarianism, where they're actually a little less consistent. They're more consistent with reality, but reality is not nominalism. And this is where problems actually begin to start, is that libertarianism and constitutional conservatism and actually all classically liberal ideologies, from classical liberalism to libertarianism to full-blown Marxism and fascism, they all have these same four problematic presuppositions in them that I'm about to address. And so with nominalism, we're no longer like we're talking about like truth, like what is truth. In the classical conception of the Christian conception, the Greek conception, truth is me receiving something from the outside, input from the outside, and conforming my mind to it. So the object really does exist outside of me. And truth is me conforming my mind to fit the object as it actually is. So subject is in here, object is out there. What nominalism is doing is saying subject is out there and I can make it whatever the fuck I want. And object is actually in here. The only thing I can really, really, truly know is what's in my head. And that's why I'm certain that women can have penises. It's like
you get solipsism where they go, I can't even know what's in my head.
And by the way, if you talk bad to me, you are attacking the object of truth I know in here, and that's why that's a microaggression. and that's why I am justified in using absolute force against you. And because the rest of the world is just a blank slate that I can create as I want, because it's the subject, not me. It's like, the subject, the rest of reality needs to conform to me, the object of truth, which is in here. And I know it because I thought through. That's nominalism. And so you're going to be thinking, where the fuck does this come in libertarianism? We'll get there. So it's way less crazy. It sounds way less crazy than that. Like this again, the left is actually the logically consistent ones when it comes to nominalism. When it comes to actually applying it in libertarianism, they're not actually all that consistent. You do get some performative contradictions in there because generally these people really do believe in like logic and goodness and stuff like that, and they're not. These people themselves are much more consistent with reality rather than actual philosophy. And so we get moving forward, we get to a man named Rene Descartes, and this is where he's taken this idea of nominalism. One of the problems you get with nominalism really quickly is now that we've destroyed these abstract properties, and these things that we're calling them no longer have like a causal impact on reality. We can't use the law of causality in order to determine good and evil. It's like you can't know these things. These things are like epistemology itself basically breaks. You have no actual a way of knowing for sure that something is good or something is evil or something is rational or not. And so, you start to, have a real doubt. And Rene Descartes, he actually kind of is the first one to really systematize this, and saying that, I notice sometimes that, my senses can deceive me. It's like if I look at like a pencil in water, in a glass of water, it looks like it's broken. And, granted he didn't have pencil, but that's kind of like an example of what he's talking about. Is it looks like it's broken when I know through other senses that it's actually not broken. And so he goes through this entire system of, well, what if I just doubt everything? What can I be absolutely certain of? He's like, I think, therefore I am. That's cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Therefore, he says, this is the only thing I can truly know as the source of being. So remember how we said God earlier, that God is the source of all of that being? Well, I can't know him anymore. Nominalism kind of breaks epistemology. I have no way of actually knowing God anymore. And this is something we'll get to with Kant, because Kant realizes this problem and tries to solve it. And he doesn't succeed. Anyway, but we get to Descartes, who kind of sees this problem as well. It's like, well, what can I actually truly know? Because that's where I have to start. The only things I can truly know are inside of myself, and so I have to start there, because I can't trust my senses. I have to start there. This is the only.
Ayn Rand rolling in her grave.
I know. I know. Okay, and by the way, I'll actually mention Rand there. One thing she really got right was that Kant was such a bastard.
Yes.
It's like she really liked Aquinas and Aristotle. Like, great woman, except for everything else.
Yeah.
She managed to screw everything else
so
up.
Far.
He really got that one thing right, though. Anyway, but so. We get Kant, who's like, okay, we can't know God.
Know God.
Because this is where we actually get that leap of faith from. So technically, Protestantism doesn't really. It's like some Protestant sects really reject, the traditional philosophy that comes from the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, and like Luther famously called reason like a whore. That reason's a whore that is like the enemy of faith. And Kant is actually a Lutheran, and so this is where he kind of gets that from. Is that this idea that faith and reason can't actually touch each other? And that's why a leap of faith becomes necessary in order to believe in God, because faith and reason, instead of being allies like they were in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church, now they're actually mortal enemies, and there needs to be this wall in between so that they don't destroy each other.
I'm sorry, but okay, reason is a whore or 99 theses on the wall. Like, pick one.
I know, right?
Like, what the fuck?
I know, and I say, Luther is not all that consistent, whereas Kant, actually sees these problems, tones down Luther quite a lot, and then tries to give it a philosophical rigor to it. And so again, faith and reason can't touch each other. That's why it becomes necessary. How convenient for the state. It's like, so now politics is now detached from religion, because remember, reason, politics comes from reason. And that exists in one sphere, and there's this nice convenient air gap where and then faith exists on the other side. Therefore, nominalism ends up being highly convenient to both corrupt statesmen and property owners alike, who don't want any sort of accountability to God. Because that's a liability, that's a responsibility. And now as a statesman, truth detection is no longer a core competency or a core duty of statesmen. No duh. It's like this is where that started off with. And so this is where we actually get separation of church and state from, because the church, that's faith, that is over here, and we're going to have a nice wall in between that and logic, which is where politics comes from. So therefore, now we're going to, me as a statesman, I'm not a theologian. I can't tell which of these is the real church or not. So I'm just going to treat them all neutral. State atheism minus the name. That's what separation of church and state is. So this is where that logically comes from in the so-called Enlightenment. So God is now.
We're going to build a wall, but we're going to make the Catholic Church pay for it.
Exactly. It's like, we're going to make all of human civilization pay for it in the 20th century. It's like Catholic Church is like, that's like just the very beginning. It gets so much worse. So anyway, it's like, so now thanks to this idea of nominalism, that again, this idea that abstract properties don't actually exist. They're just like names that that humans are, from the inside subjectively applying to the outside world. And we can't actually know what the outside world is. We just have this experience of what it is that is entirely subjective. And it's like, we don't know reality. We only know our experience of reality. And, because of that, we get to, have a state that's atheist. Wonderful. And I can't imagine how this is possibly going to go wrong. God's shuffled off in a court. He's never going to hinder human ambitions ever again. What could possibly go wrong? Besides the entire 20th century. So anyway, continuing with Kant. So Kant, as a Lutheran, he realizes this is a problem. It's like, because how do I get to ethics again? Like Kant, he is not a hedonist. Like he is a really, really prudent, moral man. Not prudent, but prudish is probably a better word. Like this guy, he was known to be like so disciplined and orderly in his life that he would go for a walk every single day exactly at 5 o'clock, and he was so punctual that his neighbors would actually set their clocks based off of when he walked by. Like he was that punctual. Kant is walking by, it must be 5:01. And that's how punctual this guy is. This guy is rigorous in how he lives his life. He is not some hedonist or hippie or atheist or whatever. And so he realizes that, this nominalism is actually a real problem now, because I can't use the law of causality to determine right and wrong anymore, or just to just quickly analyze whether something was good or bad. And so what he comes up with as his solution is that morality or ethics then must be a universally true rule based solely upon pure reason, without any sort of external assumptions about reality, because I can't know all that thanks to nominalism. It's like people can only know their experience of reality, not reality itself. And our senses are not, according to Descartes, our senses are not actually all that reliable. So you can't use any of that stuff. All of that stuff is external. So whatever morality must be, and I know this because I'm a good Lutheran. That it's like there must be a real morality. I live my whole life this way. And it's like there must be some way of doing it. So it must be just based upon pure reason. And this is where this dumb atheist, the other day actually got it from, because what that's actually called is transcendental idealism. As this idea of where this transcendent logic he supposedly believes in, where this actually where it comes from, he never knows. But this is actually where that comes from. This is Kant's ideology. This is Kantianism right there. Now, Kant was smart enough to know that that transcendent logic he believes in comes from God. Duh. So Kant was not stupid. This other atheist on Twitter was, and so so he decides that this actually seems, and actually when you look at it, this actually seems kind of reasonable. It's not, but you can kind of see why he'd be like, okay, so is lying good or bad? He's like, well, I know that remember, what we said earlier about how Christian, what sin actually is non-existence, but we've completely broken ourselves off from that, because that requires metaphysics. And we've just told you that even if metaphysics exists, we can't possibly know it. So it might as well not exist. So we can't use those exist, not exist definitions anymore. They're useless to us. So, he says that it must be just based on pure logic. That this is the only way we're going to know what morality actually is. And so, but which ends up being a problem later for materialists, because if you're coming from a kind of a Catholic background where you have natural law, and which is the idea that we can use reason because, we believe in one God, and that has these transcendental properties of goodness and logic and all that, because they come from the same exact source. One of them can be used to find the other. You can use morality to find logic, and you can find logic to find use logic to find morality, because they come from the same source. Now, if you're a materialist and you don't believe in God, and it's in the name that only matter exists, like only matter, energy, they call it physicalism today because it turned out that actually matter isn't all that exists. We had some stuff from quantum mechanics that kind of proved all of that wrong. So it's funny that the atheists can't even get it right within their own framework. Their own framework is not even internally coherent, and so they had to change the name. So there's if physics can touch it, then it's real. If physics can't touch it, then it's not real. We don't care. And so but now you've said, okay, there's no actual source of being. So how is it that the transcendental being of logic and the transcendental being of and the transcendental being of morality or ethics, which, by the way, neither of which you've actually justified the existence of. You've never said where these actually come from. You just assume they're out there in the ether somewhere. But why do you assume they're the same thing or even related? You have no actual reason to believe that one can find the other because you don't know that they're coming from the same source because you don't believe in God. So it's like that's kind of a problem, but they don't answer that one. They don't like it. They don't like it when you answer that question. So anyway, Kant realizes, okay, it must be all coming from interior. It must be a universal rule. So I can see that lying has real consequences, and people have a duty to tell the truth. And this is where I get that rule that okay, so lying is always bad. I know that now. And what about when the kind of the rebuttal to it is like, well, what about when the Nazi comes to the door and they ask if you have Jews in your attic, and you tell them no? It's like there are no Jews hiding under the floorboards. You know what I mean? It's like well, that's and whereas the traditional Christian morality actually makes much more sense. Is that well, they're coming in to do sin. Sin is an absence, so of goodness. Therefore, their action is a goodness. Therefore, they've lost their right to the truth. Humans have a right to the truth, except for when they alienate that right through sin. And so, if I know the Nazi is coming in because he wants to kill the Jews and send them off to like death camps or whatever, it's like I don't have to give this guy the truth. I'm not obligated to. So, whereas the traditional Christian morality solves this problem very nice and neatly, Kant has no answer for it, and nor would he because the Nazis didn't exist back then. But we got them thanks to him, and so his ethics. And by the way, this idea that you can just make ethics out of pure reason is like saying you can make a house out of pure physics. It's like no, houses are made of like wood and concrete. It's like granted, all of these are subject to the laws of physics.
They burn down the house of Christianity, and then they rebuild another house that's just made from the bricks of Christianity and go, look, we created our own morality. It just happens to look exactly like Christianity, where eventually the atheists and the materialists and physicalists go, wait, why does this look exactly like Christianity? We don't like that. We're going to do our own thing.
This must be well. We're gonna do our own thing. And actually, it's funny because it's like Karl Marx was the one guy who really understood what a problem this is. Remember how I said earlier that this transcendental logic. Why do you know that exists? Like, how do you know it's not just your experience of logic and these things differ? Substantially. This is where Mises goes and actually criticizes Karl Marx for what's called polylogism, because what Marx was saying is that there's bourgeois logic and there's proletariat logic, and the reason is these people just both have different experiences of what logic is. There's no one real logic, which is actually the rational conclusion of materialism. And so when you have, unfortunately, this is a rare Ludwig von Mises big L in his category, where he was actually wrong in criticizing Marx. Marx was correct if materialism is true. Granted, materialism is false, so this isn't actually a problem. But
Mises was right, but for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, he was right before the wrong reasons. Exactly. It's a very rare Mises L. And so by the way, I love that term polylogism. I love throwing it around now because it actually is the logical conclusion of atheism or materialism. Like, how do you know that there's actually only one source of logic, or that what you call logical, again, remember nominalism, isn't just something, a term or a name or a title that you're applying to some actions and not others based on your personal subjective experience. How do you know? You don't. It's like, and so therefore it's actually a pretty rational conclusion to say that, oh yeah, certain groups will be different based on their experiences, and sometimes they have very similar experiences, so it still makes sense to argue some of the time. And so because again, if there's two different kinds of logic or two different experiences of logic, how do you know that they're similar enough that argumentation makes sense? You might as well just like fight like animals. Maybe, but if they're that different, then maybe you should fight like animals. Maybe that is more rational, which is, by the way, the conclusion.
Now we're just saying humans can become animals.
Yeah, and this is basically what Marx
children
says.
pretending to be cats in schools and putting litter boxes in the fucking closet. So I mean, it's like,
yeah, it's like this is their experience. How dare you criticize that, you bigot? And so it's like this idea that you can say that that I have ethics that's founded on pure reason. It's like it's like no, like logic is just like a tool or a methodology. It's not like a thing in itself. And this it's like saying my house is like free floating in space and it's not actually made of wood and concrete and sitting on a concrete slab due to the laws of physics, but it's like actually made of pure physics itself. It's like that's just delusional and stupid. It's like they clearly just don't understand. Whenever like an atheist will say this, is like they clearly just don't understand philosophy. And this is also where I mentioned Ayn Rand. We mentioned Ayn Rand earlier. So one thing she really got right was what a bastard Kant was. It's like she thought that Ayn Rand demolished epistemology and was responsible for the 20th century. He was. It's like amongst others. It's like he gave the philosophical rigor to the system that kind of led to the Nazis and the commies and and the progressives. All three evil ideologies of the 20th century. And the Catholics did try to warn you. Well, that how much that worked out for. But anyway, and so it's like he did demolish epistemology, and now we have men thinking that they're women because those terms are just terms that humans subjectively apply based on their personal experience, and all that nonsense is nominalism. And so where does this actually come up in libertarianism? So remember, libertarianism is actually not very consistent with that. It is in there, but they actually try to make it a little bit more consistent with reality. So you get to like Rothbard and Hoppe, who, to their credit, really thought all of this shit through. It's like these were clearly philosophically literate men, and when libertarians disagree with them, they do so because they're inconsistent with their own fundamental assumptions about reality. There's presuppositional differences. When you say, "Oh, I disagree with Rothbard's conclusion about like abortion or something like that," it's like that's not the real disagreement. That's not the core of the disagreement. The core of the disagreement is actually much lower down than that, to where you have some different philosophical assumption about reality. And so so when we say remember, there's this kind of notion that libertarianism is pure logic. It's just a priori true. Well, how a priori true is it actually? And like all classical ideologies, it's founded upon like four different philosophies. It is like this idea that it's only as a priori true as its foundational assumptions are. If any of its assumptions are false, then any beliefs founded upon those assumptions are likewise false. And this is actually something Ludwig von Mises says almost verbatim in his critique. And he has a book on critiques of the praxeological method. He says there's actually four ways of attacking Austrian economics and libertarianism as well. And one of them is to question the fundamental assumption. So when you have some idiot libertarian on there who's like, nope, it's a priori true. It's like that you're making an argument proves me correct. It's like you're just a philosophically illiterate. You don't know what the fuck you're talking about. It's like no. It's like this is that actually you can question whether it's a priori true or not based on whether its fundamental assumptions that it's built on are true or false. And so the libertarian podcasters who told you that it was all that the ideology was all pure reason. These guys are just propagandists and they're philosophically illiterate. They're entertainers, not philosophers. And Mises, Rothbard, Hoppe seldom made such errors. And so what are these, four philosophies that all, from conservatism to progressivism to fascism to libertarianism, what are the four ideologies that these are all founded upon are called materialism, nominalism, subjectivism, and naturalism. We're about to see where these are used. So remember from Descartes, as atheists, Rothbard and Hoppe, they logically start with material man, as the only truly knowable source of being. That's materialism right there. So immaterial things, they either don't exist or can't be known, thanks to nominalism. So therefore, we cannot make laws as if we know God is real. And that's because that's entirely unknowable. This is what's called naturalism. So ethics, by extension, ownership, is a system of subjective norms. This is subjectivism. So when they're talking about right and wrong or just and unjust, they're not talking about like a real right and wrong. They're just talking about it as a functional necessity for like peace and prosperity, which is almost verbatim from Hoppe. It's like they're talking about a social construct. It's like Hoppe will call it, in like getting libertarianism right. Him and Rothbard will both call it like norms for minimizing conflict. So this idea that, hey, if we're going to minimize conflict, we need some sort of system of norms. And so we know that it doesn't, right and wrong don't really exist, but we need to, have some sort of system as if they exist, in order for us to kind of get along and not kill each other. And okay, sounds reasonable. And so the ownership isn't actually a real claim. It's not a real moral claim. It's just a name or a title that we are subjectively applying to some people and not others. And it exists only because we think it does, not it doesn't actually exist. And so this is where we actually get that supposed is-ought gap, is that this is what nominalism causes. That because I can no longer use the law of causality to say, okay, the abstract property of goodness will cause goodness in its effects. That will I no longer have that anymore. So because of nominalism. And so this idea that there's an is-ought gap that needs to be crossed in the first place is predicated on this idea of nominalism, making it that, these are just like terms that we're subjectively applying. So under like Roman Catholicism or really just Christianity, this thing doesn't actually exist. This is-ought gap doesn't actually exist because goodness is an abstract property that really does exist and has a causal effect on reality. So you kind of see like, so now you're thinking, okay, well, I thought you said this was a Kantian, that libertarianism was based on Kant. It is. Remember the nap. It's like that nap is actually what's called a categorical imperative. This is what when he says universally true rule, that's what's called, he calls that a categorical imperative. So and that's what the nap actually is. So he says like because each individual, who is the ultimate source of his or her own being, owns his or her own body, therefore it is always subjectively unjust for an individual to initiate aggression against another individual or their property. So and because of that, there are no unchosen obligations or duties, because I am the owner of my own existence, not a steward. So under Christianity, God's owner of everything, and I'm just a steward of creation. And so and as a steward, under Christianity, as a steward, I have a very real duty to the owner, of the property, namely myself, regardless of how I believe or how I feel about it. Whereas like owners are only accountable to themselves. This is why, it is supposedly morally neutral. This is why libertarianism is supposedly morally neutral, because owners are only accountable to themselves. And again, this is predicated on the idea that man is the owner of himself. That's self-ownership. That means he has a claim to as his own source of being. And not that he comes from some other source of being. So, and because of this, duties, and because I am unable to transfer the title, to my body, that is the claim of ownership. I'm unable to transfer this body to somebody else yet. Because of that, any duties I have to be continuously chosen. So that means things like fatherhood, motherhood, all of these are revocable. And this is why when you get the crazy libertarians who are like, oh yeah, if you want to like ace, who's like, oh yeah, if a parent wants to abandon his kid, actually that's okay. and the kid if the kid wants to kind of run away from home, that's his right or whatever. And and so all of these, both like childhood and parenthood are both like revocable claims. Like I don't have to take care of my parents when they get old if I don't want to. It's a revoke. Because there's no title. I can't transfer the title to my own body. It's physically impossible. And so the idea that a duty must be continuously chosen yeah, actually, Ace is right. If nominalism is true, if materialism is true and all that, he's right. And you disagree with him because you haven't actually thought this all through. And like you can start to see how this can go very, very wrong. And how this idea of like nominalism, subjectivism, materialism, which libertarianism definitely presupposes, are really inconsistent with what the Christian concept of reality. But it gets worse because remember how we said that these like sins and error are non-existent. Well, nope, not anymore. These are just names that are subjectively applied. So it has big implications for libertarian social policy because now all of a sudden, instead of being an absence of goodness, like addiction is a right. It's a human action. You own your own body. You can choose whatever you want to put in it, and it doesn't matter. And sex work is a right. Gluttony is a right. All these sins, which again, the reason this is going to make a problem for Christianity is that for something to for you to have a right to something, that thing has to exist. That's why, like, when I say there's no right to change your gender, is because that's physically impossible. It's like doesn't exist. It's logically, physically impossible. There cannot possibly be a right to this. Because it doesn't exist. And so but all of a sudden under libertarianism, because the material world is all that exists, because man is the only logical source of his own being, is the only real starting point. Again, thanks to Descartes. It's like all of a sudden these things are rights. We are the owners of ourselves. We are not accountable to anybody else. And it rejects that. And so you also see like this rejection of Platonic realism. That's again what we started with. It also has implications for like slander and libel laws because under Platonic realism, my reputation is something that truly does exist. It is an abstract property attached to my person. Like remember, like when God says, I think it's like the third commandment. He says, you shall not carry my name. He's not an idiot. You shall not use my name in vain. The word in Hebrew is actually carry. You shall not carry my name in vain. In other words, you're not allowed to use my name to commit sin because if you do, I'm not going to forgive you. Which is like what he actually says. And he's not an idiot. So he's not talking about like saying, oh my God, or whatever. He's actually saying like, don't sin in my name because you destroy my reputation. And why? Because I have a right to my own reputation. It exists in me. And so you have no right to that. And so under Christianity, your reputation really does exist. It really is scarce. It only exists with you. It doesn't just exist in other people's mind like it does under nominalism. Again, this is where that comes from. This idea that your reputation only exists in the minds of everybody else is only true if nominalism is true. And it's not true if Platonic realism is true. So, actually, these philosophies really do make a difference. They show up, in like how these laws actually exist. So that's why when the Lord says, you shall not slander, you shall not bear false witness, and all that, these are all sins. You don't have a right to do them. It's like that is not compatible with libertarianism that says, your reputation just exists in the minds of other people. You don't have a right to that. They're like, these are really, really different, and like these are not compatible. And so when we're going into this and we're saying, what is the actual thing that exists? So this is like framing the discussion now. Now that we're an hour in. Oops, I said it was going to be 10 minutes.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's
It's a little 10 minutes.
You ever watch Dragon Ball Z at all?
I know, right?
Frieza, the Namek will blow up in 5 minutes.
It's like 3 episodes later. Anyway, so basically, what we're what's being discussed and what's not, because I can hear the objections already. It's like what's being discussed is the scope of rights and duties that actually exist and what these things actually consist of. What's not being discussed is how these rights and duties are enforced and what the punishments for violating them ought to consist of. And on the latter point, like I said at the outset, I readily admit that there's a ton of overlap and compatibility on the second issue. It's like but albeit very different reasons why. It's like what I'm concerned with is what is enforceable, not how it's actually enforced. And so the common objection I get was, oh, so you think you need a state for all of this? And it's like, okay, that's beside the point. And it's irrelevant to whether a right is. how a state enforces it, whether like through prohibition or taxation or regulation or something like that, is just a question of prudence, not a question of do they have the right to do anything about it in the first place. So the idea, so like when we say, okay, so you say like drug addiction is not a right, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to have a blanket prohibition? Are you going to slap some taxes and regulations on it? Those are very different things. It's like, who's going to do it? Is it just the state is a monopoly on violence, or is it a more decentralized system like the family? Where whose right is it actually, and does a right actually exist in the first place? It's like those are prudential questions. Those are questions of prudence. Like, is it again, resources are scarce and we have to optimize them. So it makes a difference. So like maybe prohibition is really counterproductive and we don't actually want to do that. That's a prudence question. That's not a justice question. The incompatibilities I'm honing in on are questions of justice, not of prudence. And they're related, but they're not the same. And so in order to even have the prudence question, you have to first have the justice question of what rights exist in the first place, what duties exist in the first place. Libertarians will say there are no unchosen duties. Those don't exist because I'm the owner of my own being. I'm the source of my own being. I'm my own God, basically. And so unchosen duties don't exist. Only rights exist. And so, and my duty is only to myself. So, I don't have no real, duties to, do anything besides myself. And, that's very different than saying, God actually exists. He's the owner of everything. You're a steward and you have a duty to him and to your neighbors by extension. Like those are very, very different, very different systems of justice. And to say that like the latter has way more rights and duties that are truly enforceable. And doesn't matter how you enforce them. We're not saying how you enforce them yet. We're just saying that they are enforceable in the first place somehow. And whereas libertarians will say, no, it's like sex work is a right. You have no right to enforce anything against me. That in the first place, I own myself. I own my own body. If I want to, if I want to mutilate it or I want to do whatever with it, it's like that's my right. If I want to smear my body in mayonnaise, take pictures, and sell them door to door to children, that's my right. And you have nothing to say, and there's nothing that you can do to stop me. And it's like, no, that's not true, actually. That's like, that, again, that very much depends on whether these, philosophies like nominalism, materialism, naturalism, et cetera, are all true. It hinges on that. But for the sake of the discussion, this is not what Christianity believes, nor is it what it's compatible with. Now, and basically you have to, what happens is, remember we said that the one area of agreement is that you have to have a first principle. Any system that's true has to have a first principle. And so we have two contradicting first principles. One that says that man is the source of his own being, and the other says that the logos is the source of all being, and they yield radically different results. Is it that all rights are reserved to the individual man, or are all rights reserved to God? And these are all of a sudden you get very real, potentially legally binding, unchosen obligations to God and fellow man if Christianity is true. If it's not, then then it's not. And it's not like, oh, this is just like your feelings, which, by the way, is like where Kant was coming from. Is that this faith, again, it's like, oh, it's just like your feelings or whatever, and you have no right to enforce that on other people. It's like, no, all of a sudden it's like this thing's either true or false, and it makes a causal difference to reality. And so, it's kind of like math. It's not like, oh, if you don't believe in math, tough luck. You're just wrong and delusional. Facts don't care about your feelings. You can disagree with God all you want. It doesn't change anything if it's true. If it's false, that changes quite a lot. And property rights are no longer absolute under Christianity because man is not the owner of himself. He's a steward only, and steward has and as a steward, he has a very real obligation to do his very best with what he's given. Remember the parable of the talents. If you're a really big brain Christian, you got 5 talents, you owe God. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a big gift. If you're like some sub 80 IQ atheist, you got 1 talent, you still owe one back. It's like you got to do the best you can with what you have. There's a big difference right there between that and libertarianism, where you're only accountable to yourself, and there's no right to sin, because properly speaking, sin doesn't exist. Something has to exist in the first place for you to even potentially have a right to it. Whereas under libertarianism, it's like there's not really such a thing as sin, because that presumes metaphysics. So it's like these, this is where I say these are not actually compatible ideologies. Because they have fundamentally different first principles and worldviews attached to them. And so while libertarians and Catholics might both agree that, prohibiting sex work is probably counterproductive and shouldn't be done, they do so for different reasons. Like the libertarian believes you shouldn't do it at all in the first place because that, person has a right to their own body and they're the owner. And so there's no enforceable violation of anything in the first place. Again, whereas like the Catholic believes that no, there's no right to sin, but if we do a blanket prohibition, it's likely to make the situation much worse. We're going to get greater sins, and so that's a violation of prudence, but not of justice. And so, and you do have quite a lot of overlap there, just on the prudence question, but they're for different reasons. They're not for, and ultimately these are going to be incompatible. And so a Christian society and a libertarian society are ultimately going to be very, very different if taken to their actual logical conclusions.
Okay, so
now it's time to begin discussion.
Yes. So I want to start out with some questions based upon all of that, and we're going to start out in the We'll kind of go through things kind of in order. I'll start with kind of questioning some of the philosophical claims and presuppositions that you put out there. So I want to ask, in the ideas that you put out there about sin, and that there's no right to sin, and sin doesn't exist, darkness is a privation of light, etc. And I can kind of understand where you're coming from with that.
All things came into being through him.
So
that's where that comes from.
All things, all things created through him, the Logos. Does freedom exist, and specifically, does human free will exist? And God, the Calvinist is asking this, but
the idea that free will, basically, what we said about that earlier. Let me get back to that slide. What free will actually exists of? Well, what is the free part? Human will obviously exists, but what does the freedom part mean? Again, the freedom part is that you are free to choose not to exist. There is that which exists that you can choose, that is God, that is his ways. And then that which does not exist is you don't have to choose him. But he gives you this ability to choose non-existence, which is, again, why, the wages of sin is death, why, it's always likened to debt and slavery, as increasing privation, deprivation, really.
But the freedom to choose to turn away from the light and to turn away from existence and to head toward non-existence and the absence of light, it's like, I agree when I turn my light bulb off that in this room I'm in, that darkness sets in. Now the darkness isn't there, but I have a choice to exist in that darkness.
Mm-hmm.
So
but the idea is, do you have a property right to something called darkness? And the answer is, well, there's no such thing, actually.
But what I'm saying is, to me, this is a bit of a semantical thing, right? Like, you're saying you don't have a right to something that doesn't exist, but I'm saying what exists that humans technically have a right to, in a sense. Now we also need to define what rights are, and we'll get to that.
It's a moral claim.
But because we have free will given to us by God. Mm-hmm. We have not a right to something that doesn't exist. We have a right and the ability to choose to not follow God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we are not free from the consequences of not following God. And, there are many libertarians and libertines who will, when you suggest that, listen, you can sin, you're not
Yeah.
free from the consequences of your sin. I agree with you. People are going to,
But that's also true.
yeah, they're going to face you will reap what you sow. And I believe that. But, people are definitely, while they are not free from the consequences of their sin, but they are, in a sense, free to sin. They are
And
free
what's
to
that?
they are free to turn away from God.
Yeah, you're free to sell yourself into slavery. Is that freedom? That sounds a weird way of comprehending freedom. If you say, "Oh, I'm free to die," or like I'm free to sell myself into
Well,
slavery,
can you? Well,
like
this
that seems like
leads.
an oxymoron. It's
Well,
a
this leads
contradiction
into
term.
my next question, which is is a choice that is made, you know, that is not made freely. If someone only has the choice to do what is good, is it a moral choice?
Yeah, because because the reason why the only thing that actually exists is good, and non-existence is evil. Is that's what that actually is in fact. And so you can choose non-existence, but it's non-existence. It's like you can, and again, you can't have a right to something that doesn't exist. It's like this. It's the same reason why you don't have a right to change your gender. It's impossible. It's like you cannot physically do it, and so there can't possibly be a right to it, because in order for a right to something to exist, the thing itself
Let's
has to.
let's 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 define, because we've used the term a few times now. Let's define what rights are, because we need to
I would
try
say
to maybe have
moral
the
claim of
same
control.
definition there. What was that?
A moral claim of control. So the control over something like my body, my property, my phone. It's like these things I have a moral claim to. So that you're presupposing several things. One, the something itself exists. The two, that morality exists. Those, and that three, that it's possible to control the thing itself. So three things you need. And so if there's no such thing as morality, there's no such thing as rights. And that's kind of basic for a Christian.
I,
There's
I
some
think that's
atheists.
similar to my definition of rights would be things that you have a claim to. I don't know if they necessarily have to be property. I mean,
Technically,
you can describe them in ways of
yeah.
property, but for example, I have a right to not be murdered, and so that's a right. Now you can say that's a right to my body, but then you're kind of using a libertarian
Yeah, in
metaphysic
the
there.
if you really want to go get strict with this, the biblical definition is not something you have so much as something you inhabit. So, like the idea of righteousness means to be in the right. So when we say you are within your rights, is like you are within the right. There's this dimension called there's this abstract dimension called rightness, and to be outside of it is wrong. But you can only inhabit it if you choose it. And so you can choose not to inhabit this dimension called rightness, and so, or righteousness. And so it's a property that's abstract to yourself, but it's like an abstract dimension that you can or you cannot inhabit, and based on your choice. And so the like whether so to say someone is within his rights is to say he is within the right. And the right is right, the wrong and the left is always wrong, of course. And so but yeah, so that's actually the biblical definition. It's not something you have so much as something you inhabit. And when you see like guys like St. Thomas Aquinas talking about it, he's using the biblical definition. And whereas in common parlance, we kind of use it the other way. And the other way is not wrong, but it's not quite as accurate as what the Bible is saying, what the saints are saying, and not and what like the Greeks would be meaning by it.
Hmm. Yeah, no,
So
and
the,
this gets to another question, which, and I'm trying to not jump around too much here, but I'm trying to kind of go in a natural progression.
Go ahead.
So I agree with you on the idea of what biblical rights are, and I agree with you on a lot of the metaphysics and framing that you put out there. a concern I have, and why I would then, from this concern, why I think libertarianism is useful and I think it's also needed, is that, and the I'm not saying the Bible doesn't answer this, but there is a question of how do we tend to the non-believers? How do we deal with those who
Yes, the food
are,
actual question.
yeah? So how do we deal with those who have not accepted the truth, even though the truth is written in their heart? And I think, I don't think there's anyone who truly doesn't believe God exists if you really got down to the deepest fiber of their being.
Yeah.
Even Satan believes God exists. So
I mean, it's like if you're really going to be rationally consistent, you kind of got to be like Nietzsche and
yeah,
you're ahead of yourself. It's like if it really is all, if
God
God
is
doesn't
dead,
exist,
and so am I.
yeah, it's like if it's all meaningless, what the fuck are you still doing here? So it's
Right,
like, okay, so clearly on some level you don't actually believe it's all meaningless,
right. But
and
there are people
even
that are,
even to say, oh well, I'm just going to subjectively create my own meaning. Well, that too is meaningless. It's like if you're really going to be rationally consistent about this, you kind of gotta off yourself or just like live like a total hedonist. Like those are like the only two options, and the latter one is actually less consistent.
it's begging the question. Like, there's no
Yeah,
meaning, but I will create my own meaning, even though there is no meaning. Like, what?
yeah, it actually exists. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah. So like, what do you do about like non-believers? That again, that's a prudential question. It's like there are it's a real discussion that you can have, and I think one way we would know for sure is if you actually implemented a full blown private property society. Well, because again, like we said, if materialism and nominalism are true, and these things really are just titles, there's no reason to expect that Christianity might have a tactical strategic advantage. Whereas, like, because if these things are actually Platonic realism is true, which is again a fundamental philosophy to Christianity, or it's the one that Christianity holds to be true, that these things really are abstract properties that have a causal impact on reality. Which, by the way, all of my debates with Ace are about this right there: Platonic realism versus nominalism. He never quite realized it, but this is where that actually is. When I'm saying that these things actually have a causal impact on reality, and he's saying no, they're not. It's like, how's that possible? There's an is-ought gap. And it's like, no, not necessarily. And this is where those debates all come from. I got bored with them eventually, but basically, if Platonic realism is true and these are abstract properties, what you would expect is that a moral society will end up doing much better, much more prosperous, much more peaceful, much more powerful, much more wealthy, etc. Based on that causality of goodness. And whereas the hedonist society is going to eat itself into communism really
well, this is
quickly.
why the left hates capitalism, because
Yeah,
they know that they know that
they know they're going
capitalism
to
wouldn't
lose.
sustain their lifestyles and their values.
Yeah, I mean they're a parasite. They're going to
Yeah.
lose. It's
So
like,
they need a little bit of capitalism to survive on, though. So it's like this love hate thing. It's like they need to like put the little
eventually,
ghost of capitalism in the machine just enough to make it work a little bit.
eventually, I mean, it's like what Margaret Thatcher says. The problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money,
Right.
and it's I think Deng Xiaoping, he's the guy who came in after Mao. He said, we need to at least have some rich people before we can kill them. It's like this is after the Great Leap Forward, which like decimated China's population. It's like clearly this acts of evil caused greater evil like poverty and famine.
Declining population is bad for society? What?
Imagine why. It's like you mean that killing 40 million women is going to is going to cause problems for sexually deprived
No, no,
men
no, no,
later
Andrew,
on.
Andrew. The left loves women, but they can't tell you what they are.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Getting
like,
off
so
topic,
yeah,
but
obviously this stuff has real practical problems to it, and if you really want to take these things to their logical conclusion, it's like you could say that the left-wing liberal materialist libertarian society is going to be like a clusterfuck and a disaster, and what's actually going to win out if private property really is observed is the Christian one, as if Platonic realism is true. And if abstract properties really do exist, and major tenets of libertarianism like intellectual property and stuff like that are actually false. It's like those are big implications that cannot be ignored. So what do you do about it? Well, okay, eventually the Catholics are going to end up running the planet, and it turns out they're already like the world's largest landowner. Or at least they were until McDonald's came along. McDonald's is now the largest landowner in the world as of like 2009. But for like the 2,000 years preceding that, it was the Catholic Church. So it's like, actually, it seems like it's working out. It's like, expectation is actually meeting the theory, which is kind of, which really tough to explain unless you're really tough to explain from a materialist point of view. Because you told me all of this stuff was bullshit and like it doesn't work, it's not real. So what the heck? How come they're succeeding so well? And they've been around for 2,000 fucking years. It's like, and they're like a single organization that really hasn't changed at all, since not basically the beginning. And so, how in the world is that possible? Well, maybe they're onto some sort of permanent truth.
And the one major change they did in the last century was a mistake.
Yeah, it was like the Vatican II. We won't go there. Yeah. So it's like that's that's its own podcast. We won't go there.
Yeah.
But if you want to listen to, if you want more information on that, we're going to put some links in the discussion that kind of start to address that, because this is where the Catholics decided that it's looking kind of dangerous. What if we made a few compromises with the world, and we're not going to change any doctrines officially, but we're going to like change how we talk about these doctrines so that it kind of reflects the error. And
compromising always worked out well for ancient Israel, didn't it? I mean,
I know, right? I can't imagine how this could possibly go wrong. And anyway, but
so bringing back to the topic at hand, with libertarianism, where I think this comes into play with Christianity, why I don't think the two are incompatible, is that I'm not building libertarianism on, I guess, like a secular foundation of self-ownership being the end-all be-all or the presupposition. Really, I view libertarianism more as a answer to a question, and the question that I think that needs to be answered is, when is the use of force justified? And I think that the only consistent answer biblically and using logic, and I think, again, you and I agree these are all connected, because the Bible comes from God, and rationality and logic and morality come from God, so they all end up saying the same answer. But I think that the answer to when is the use of force morally justified is that it is morally justified in the enforcement of basically property rights, and in the enforcement of if someone is committing aggression against someone else, whether that's violence upon their body or a violation of their property, that is when the use of force is justified. And libertarianism seeks to elaborate on how this plays out in the real world. And then there's also, I guess, like the second element would be the instruments of civil governance that we use to enforce property rights. What should they look like? So there's a
second prudential question. That's different than the justice question.
There's the what is normative, and there's the praxeological. How do we enforce what is normative?
Yeah, and how I respond to that is kind of what I said over here, is that it's a question of, it's like, okay, you can only aggress against people's rights and duties assuming that they exist. And so that's kind of, when you say this, like, okay, you're not allowed to aggress against people's property rights. Well, that's kind of begging the question, what are those rights? What are those duties? What's the full scope of what they consist of? Because like a libertarian will say, there's no such thing as unchosen duties and that aren't continuously chosen. And whereas that's not what a Christian will say. As like, these are very different things. And like,
well, hold on. I might disagree with you on that, but I think that we need to define what you mean by a positive duty, because is there a positive duty in terms of what God requires of us based upon his written and moral decrees? Yes. But that is positive duties insofar as the obligations we have from our vertical relationship with God. I think on the horizontal field, when it comes to...
It's not like if I don't have a relationship with God that all of a sudden these rules don't apply to me. That
No, no,
no,
no.
no, no,
Everyone has a relationship with God, whether they choose to or not. I'm not saying there's a
yeah.
choice in that. We all have that positive obligation from God in terms of those moral duties, and
And
God enforces them on us just by His very essence of
again, that's an
being. Because
abstract copyright.
if we don't fulfill those moral obligations, we're in sin, and we know what happens when you sin. So you and I
Yeah,
are in
again,
perfect
that's an
agreement
actual
there.
abstract property that you either partake of or you don't,
Right.
and it has real causal consequences to
Yes.
reality.
Yes, I
And so
agree.
the idea that just because you don't believe in it, well, it's like that doesn't matter. It's like you can choose not to believe in math or believe that math is racist, and you're just delusional and wrong. It doesn't
Right.
matter
Well,
what
this
you
is why
think.
I said before you are free to choose to reject God, but you're not free from the consequences of what happens when you reject God and you reject His commands. But I think
But you
the
actually have a
distinction that
right.
I think is important to make here is that although God, by His very nature, enforces those positive duties and obligations, humans, I do not think, but based both on
Well,
what we see in the
again,
Bible and what we see and what we can logically derive as consistent, is humans cannot enforce a positive obligation on another human that came from God. God enforces that, not people.
again, the question is like, what is a just law? What does that, what makes a law just or unjust? And that is the idea that it comes from natural law. So natural law kind of gives you like the broad abstract principle, whereas human law says, okay, here's how we're actually going to recognize and implement that. And that we recognize there is a right not to be murdered. But if someone is, are we going to give them the death penalty or 10 years in jail or a pat on the back? It's like how a human law actually approximates that
Well,
is very different. And
and
so
I'll meet you in, like pretty
yeah,
far in the middle here, which is that I agree that we should model our laws after natural law, after God's law, and I think that we should have a law, so to speak, against homosexual marriage. But I don't think that law should be enforced by violence. I think rather market law, capitalism,
and
applying a
that's
massive
a fundamental question.
forces the market forces of disincentivizing that which is sinful, which is what the market would do because there really is nothing productive that can come from a homosexual pairing. It
Yeah,
produces no children. It produces nothing of benefit to society. Now,
there's
would
no
we?
actual marriage there.
Yeah. Now, would we? The only question that I seek to answer as a
Yes.
libertarian is should we is this a law where we should use the civil authorities and wield the sword to stop them, or is this something that the law needs to be enforced through uh through something outside of those civil authorities?
Well,
Because
let's say like let's take an easier one. Like again, this is a prudential question that something needs to be enforced against in the first place is kind of begging the question that this is something you're outside of your rights in. So the idea that a homosexual homosexuality is outside of people's rights and it needs laws against it to disadvantage it is begging the question that this thing is actually outside of people's rights in the first place, which is the thing I'm concerned with because libertarians would say, no, you're within your rights if you want to, sodomy is completely within your rights as long as you're consenting to it.
right, well,
So
libertarians are
that's begging the
concerned
question.
with libertarians are concerned with the use of force. So in the
Yeah,
idea of
what is
in the
actually
civil
enforceable in the
sense,
first place.
in the civil sense, you have a right to do things that are not violating the civil rights of others. But again, this is why I think having laying things out in terms of vertical and horizontal relationships is very important. And then looking upon those, the horizontal relationships and going, when can we use force and when can't we? And I don't think it's begging the question so much as it is recognizing when violence is justified and when it isn't. And it's not that we're saying
Yeah,
someone has a right to do a thing that doesn't exist in terms of gay marriage and which is sin.
I mean,
I'm
that's
not saying people have a right to sin. I'm saying people have a right to not have violence be initiated against them just
right.
for the act of not following God's
Yeah,
commands
the act
insofar
aside.
as they're not violating, the rights of other people as they do so.
Yeah, but those are all begging the questions. Again, it's like you can
So
only have a
where's the
right to
question being
something that
begged?
exists. That the idea that there is a right of others, or what that set actually consists of. Those values are actually in the subset. You know what I mean? It's like you actually have to start at the first principle of where these things come from in the first place. And because if they don't come from, if there's no place they actually come from, then they don't actually exist, and you can't have a right to something that doesn't exist. So that is
But so this is where this goes back to my first
that's the
question,
crux of my
which is
argument. Is that it's only just to use force against people, when they are outside of their rights, when they are not inhabiting that dimension of rightness. When they are outside of their rights, that's when it's okay to use force. Prudently, of course. But
right. But here's
but
where
that's
we
a separate
disagree
question.
is you're saying they don't have a right to sin, and I'm saying it's not that they have a right to sin, it's that they have a right to use their free will to turn away from God. It's not that they have a right. So it's not that I have a right to the darkness that
To
me turning
non-existent.
my light. It's not that I have a right to the darkness that happens when I take the light away. It's just that I have a right to go to the light switch and turn it off, or I have a right to cover my eyes up and not
Yeah,
look at the light.
but you can't say, oh, like there was, like some light out that came in from outside or whatever, violated my right to this darkness. I wanted this, darkness. It's a thing. It's like, no, it's not actually a thing. It's like,
No,
why?
it's more like we don't. It's they have a right. Like if they're sitting there closing their eyes because they don't want to look at the light,
Mhm.
we don't have a right to go up to them and use violence to force their eyes open.
Yeah, and because they have a right to like their own body, and to close their own eyes. There's nothing about that is outside of their rights. However, it's like I want to have another man's dick inside my asshole. That is, I am outside of my rights. I don't have that right, and the other guy doesn't have the right to put it in me. It's like that's there's I am like both of us are definitionally outside of our rights with that because that's sin. There can it's like just because I own my own body doesn't mean I can do whatever the hell I want with it. And libertarians already recognize this kind of
Yes.
like I can't use it to hurt other people. So clearly there's a limit, and it's just a question of where's the actual line. And whereas again, if I'm the source of my own being, I'm only accountable to myself and I can do whatever I want. Whereas if I'm a steward of creation and I'm accountable to God, and all rights came into existence through Him, and a right to, and sin wasn't one of them because it doesn't exist.
So
It's like then I can't have it. I can't do it. It's like I'm definitionally outside of my rights, and force is on the table. Then it would
so
be a
let's
legitimate response to that.
sure. So I get what you're saying. I think that if the project that I was pursuing was taking pure secular libertarianism, which is a round peg, and the square hole of Christianity, and trying to force the round peg into the square hole,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't work, and
Yeah,
you would
like
be right to call
homosexual
that out.
equality.
Yes. um, what I think you're getting wrong when you criticize Christian libertarianism is that I think Christian libertarianism is its own subset. It's not secular libertarianism. It's rather saying, listen, here are the things libertarians get right. They get right. It's not about rights in the
They're trying
true,
to
ultimate, biblical, godly, metaphysical sense. It's about civil rights and what civil authorities can and can't do. So it's
yeah,
taking
they're having a little bit of a performative contradiction because they're trying to have the conclusions of libertarianism, which are particular to these other philosophies, like materialism, nominalism, etc. And they're trying to have that, but they're trying to use Christian presuppositions to get there, and that doesn't actually work.
what
And
conclude.
it's
So
like,
the only conclusion that I'm trying to arrive at is, I mean, listen, you and I both agree that it's sinful to, if you were born a man, to try to do any sort of altercations, chemically or physically or both, to your body to then claim that you are now living as a woman. We'd say it's
Yeah.
sinful for a man to lie with a man, a woman to lie with a woman, or
It's sinful to abandon your child, or for your or for a child
right,
not to take
yes,
care of, a good, loving parent, et cetera, that took care
right.
of them.
There are
It's just
many
like
things. There are
you have
many
a
things that are sinful that you and I agree on. That a lot of libertarians would be like, well, there's nothing wrong with. Not only do they have a right to it, there's nothing wrong with it at all. You and I both agree there's something
yeah.
wrong with it. The
But
Christian
if there's something
libertarian is not
wrong,
trying to
why is
do
forcing
anything in relation to calling those things that are wrong any less wrong. They're simply trying to answer the question of, based upon what we know about civil governance from God's revealed law, both in scriptures and with because you're not like some cringe Protestants that I run into who go, you can only use scripture alone and you can't use your reason and you can't use philosophy. We view reason and philosophy as part of God's revealed order, and that these things are not in conflict; they're actually the same thing, compatible.
Yeah, let me
And
try to
so
rephrase what I think you're saying. You're saying that Christian libertarians are not making a just, they agree on the justice parts, wholeheartedly. It's like they're saying that the reason I still call myself a libertarian is that this is the best, of the ideologies on the market right now. There's really only three of them. There's constitutional conservatism, progressivism, and libertarianism. Of those three that are actually on the market, libertarianism is like the best approximation of where I am as a Christian and what I actually
so
believe in.
there's
And what I
definitely
think is
that
best.
there's definitely that element. The second element I would add, and this is me uh, coming in and saying specifically libertarian anarchism, and the second element is that I do view anarchism as a sort of a horizontal description of how the Christian should relate to this world, because we're told that this world is not our home, that we are citizens of a different kingdom. And so I think that while we are on this earth, we have to view all kingdoms of men as, you know, you know, really idolatrous organizations that are, even the best ones are going to end up corrupting God's natural order and end up committing idolatry. And I think we see this in 1 Samuel 8. We see this in the example that Jesus gave us and everything. And you brought it up earlier. What Paul said: we don't struggle against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, the authorities, the forces of darkness, etc.
Why do
So
those things exist? Why do those principalities and powers and dominions, which are classifications of angels, why do they exist in the first place if they're not a part of God's natural order? It's like, see, that the Catholic and by the also Orthodox conception of why these things exist is that they are fallen angels, but what was their purpose before they fell was to guide human rulers, which presupposes that they actually exist in the first place. So it's like the idea that humans are supposed to have real leaders, real lawgivers, all this stuff. These are like, this is part of the natural order that God had actually instantiated at the beginning, and instead of following it the way that they were supposed to, actually they became idolatrous organizations, truly idolatrous. It's like,
but he said that he called out they were going to be idolatrous.
They're
And
worshiping God kings. It's like they really were idolatrous.
God told Samuel that when they asked for a king, said they aren't rejecting you, they are rejecting me as their king.
See, what that shows is like the reason they're asking for a king isn't actually the problem. The problem is they didn't want God. That they didn't, the problem was they didn't want God's morality to be enforced by a king. They were wanting a king so that they could get away from God's morality, not so that they could do it better.
I think that was part of it. I think it was also they just got out of.
If they said, hey, they wanted it for two reasons. One, because we keep getting invaded by everybody else's king, so it's militarily efficient.
Yeah, they want a king to fight. We want a king to fight our battles for us and to govern
also,
us.
Your sons are a bunch of crooks, Samuel. Yeah. It's like, so we want someone who's going to be our judge, and there's a second reason. So it's like, if we want a king, so that we can have better security, so we can better follow the law, and we can have better justice because we know that's what God really wants, and that's that would have been a-okay. but because they want, the reason they wanted those kings is like, we want to sin, we want to live like the pagans are doing, and like we want to have all this child sacrifice and all that. We don't want to do it God's way, and the king is going to help us be more efficient in our sin. It's like that's the problem right there. That's what God means when he says, you've rejected me, like you've rejected my ways. You're wanting a king for the wrong reasons. If you'd wanted a king so that you could be, more loyal to me, that would have been A-okay. That's just my facilitator. I've got dozens of those guys.
I just view it as inevitable. Like if man truly wants to follow God, I don't think he seeks to put a king above him. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not trying to be cringe Ace style anarchist where I'm like hierarchies are bad and natural leaders are bad. Like, listen, I believe in natural hierarchies and leaders and sort of that's what rulers, I think, in the biblical sense are. This is the example that Jesus gave us. He said, if any of you seeks to be first among you, he will be the last. He will be a servant. And true rulers are not those who wield the sword in violence to force compliance and coercion against subjects. Rather, they are wielding the sword outwardly in defense and in service to. And so I believe
that's the problem right there is that hey, it's a dangerous world. These things actually exist, and the reason I would want a king is that someone who's going to fight my battles, so I can go. He can go fight battles for me, so I can specialize it. Being a father.
Now I need to read Hoppa's private production of defense.
It's specialization. And by the way, we all know how production works best. It's monarchy. It's like that. It's like everything you love is built by a monarch. Basically, it's a CEO. We call them CEOs today. And it's like it's one guy in charge. He's got crap loads of power, unto himself, and he makes the decision about which way the company goes in its production.
But what he doesn't have is the right to initiate violence against the people working for him. I mean, other than if they are like, "Hey, get off my property," and they say, "No, fuck you," and then it's like, okay, well, now he has the right to.
Again, that would be that would be the reason I want a king, is to make my life, it's make it my job of being a good Christian, a good father, good husband, that much more efficient. It's like that way he can specialize at that, so I can specialize at other things that are more important to me, because I don't know how to fight. It's kind of a problem. I want to be a good Christian, but I can't go study like martial arts and combat and weapon systems and, military strategies. I don't have the time for that. It's like it's like Hayek's, famous line is like, if everyone's hired in the military, who's growing the food? I mean, you know what I mean? It's like we're all dead because we're all starved to death. But it's like we need specialization to these ends to make us better humans.
We need as many different ways to bomb brown people halfway across the world as we do iPhones.
Exactly. And so it's like, again, it's like the proper use of a military is defensive, obviously, because some people are real schmucks. It's like, some people are liberals and they want to go, and you brown people really need a king to defend you from the Republic, from the evil American Republic. It's like, that's a really good reason to have a king. It's to defend you from these guys. So it's like bad guys exist, and even then, like sometimes people make errors. It's like, again, it's not just sin that doesn't exist; it's also error. It's like when people, they weren't intending to make a mistake, but they did. Like you hit a guy, like a car crash or something like that. You weren't like intending to, like T-bone someone and kill a small child. It's like you weren't intending that. Your will, that's not a sin; it's an error. But justice still needs to be served one way or the other. Maybe you were being reckless, or maybe you were just tired and something like that, and you owe civil damages instead of criminal damages. You still need a king who can, to be the judge of a situation like that. And that is an appropriate use of a third party monopoly on justice, because if I think, it's like we get into a car accident. I think I was in the right, and you think you were in the right. Somebody has to be a judge. Yeah, we need arbitration. And, if we leave it to ourselves to pick the arbiter, we're never going to agree, because I'm only going to pick one who agrees with me, and you're only going to pick one who agrees with you. There needs to be somebody who's, a third party and a monopoly. And it sucks. It's going to make it inefficient, but it's better than, this is, by the way, someone, you get like guys like Gene Epstein who will be like, yeah, I honestly have no idea how you would get somebody to both go to the arbitrator. And, it's like that, a lot of
I
honest
think,
libertarians will
and
honestly admit that.
I'm
You
going
might
to
say,
invoke.
oh,
Here's the problem. I think there's two people who have done really good work on trying to explain this. The problem is they're an anathema to most libertarians, which is Chase Rachels and Stefan Molyneux.
yeah,
They both. It's like, and I have problems with both of those too. But back before they went totally off the wall, they did actually do a good job at sort of like speculating how a free society would get
yeah, like
people
insurance
to
companies and all that. The problem is not justice. It's like you might be, kind of like rubbing over the problem, but like that's not justice. And
But I mean, do we ever get true? Like, I think maybe
yeah,
part of the
it's like
difference
people
we
want
get.
it. It's
I
like
think
that's the thing in demand. It's like when people feel like it, it's like someone T-bones my wife and my kid dies or something like that because he's in the car seat. It's like there's no amount of money that really makes me feel better. Like I want that guy in jail. He was drunk driving or he was being really reckless and he was clearly in the wrong. It's like I'm not okay that guy's still
But then
free.
instead of
He's a threat
you
to
getting
society.
money, you're paying money out, more money now to put this person and house him in jail.
Potentially, yeah. And it's like, but that it's like the idea that nothing is going to happen to this guy. Or like maybe he pays more in car insurance, but she might not have anyway. It's like because again, there's no law that says he has to have car insurance, and and the et cetera, et cetera. It's like it's like there might legitimately be nothing that happens to him, and
This might
that
be
like
a good topic to close
yeah,
on. And, the question I would have, I mean, what are your thoughts on like? Do you think that you're maybe falling danger to like a nirvana fallacy where like you're expecting outcomes here on earth to be perfect or near perfect? And I guess like my sense of things is that like we live in a fallen world and our best efforts are going to fall short. This is why we need a savior. This is why Jesus is going to come again, and all that. And
yeah.
I think that libertarianism is sort of, and Christian
Again, it's
libertarianism specifically, is saying, listen, we could seek the perfect outcome and perfect justice here on earth, but not only is that not possible, but we see throughout history that when we try to seek that out and we try to wield the sword in pursuit of that, everything goes horribly wrong. And we create more victims and we create more injustice because the people we entrust to do that, maybe listen, you get lucky once in a while. You
I
got
would
King
reject
David
that
who,
premise actually.
well, okay,
Because like this, when I say okay, specifically the premise that when we've tried this, it's gone horribly wrong, and I would say, well, actually, if you look back at history, when we've tried this, it went wonderfully correct. It's spectacularly correct. It's like it's like if you understand, like okay, real. It's like the history of the West really begins at the fall of the Roman Empire. In the late 500s. And at that time, like humanity was like, to give you an idea how shitty the situation was, we were like brushing our teeth with urine because the ammonia is a bleaching agent. The ammonia in urine is a bleaching agent, and like 1,500 years later, we're talking on StreamYard. You know what I mean? It's like when we started with Christian monarchy, the system that theoretically this is the correct model of Christian governments is kind of like a Christian monarchy that is subservient to the church. That started roughly like 450-ish with King Clovis. And when that started, all of a sudden we start going on like a parabolic trajectory. And it really like right around like we had like kind of a long extended winter kind of in the 6th century, which really set us back because when long extended winters happen, it's a miniature ice age. When that happens, food supply contracts, population contracts, disease spreads everywhere because you have lower calories, less immune system, predatory diseases get you, et cetera, et cetera. Then we had Attila the Hun kill half of Europe, literally half. I mean, he was Hitler before. It's like 11% of the planet's population was killed by Attila the Hun, all in the West, all concentrated where we were. That collapsed the economy. That set us back again. But once we really kept, we kept at it, we kept our kings going, we kept the language alive, et cetera, through the Catholic Church. You want to read the how the Catholic Church built Western civilization by Tom Woods, excellent book. He gets into some of this, and once we really okay, we have no more civilization catastrophes that were not relevant to us, we didn't cause them at all. Right around the 9th, 10th, 11th, not 9th, but really the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, we start getting parabolic. We get the invention of science, art, philosophy, property rights themselves. It's this time period. It's we invented that. It's the Romans had something that was you could barely call it property, whereas you control it because your party is in power in the Republic. And
but is that a function of the Christianity or a function of the monarchy?
Both.
I view it more as a function of the Christianity and the Catholic Church, and I think the monarchy serves more of a backhand role at best.
And the reason is the reason that's not true is we actually have a comparison: Eastern Christianity, where monarchy never really took over, and you always had dictatorship. And so what the difference between monarchy and dictatorship is.
Well, I mean, I'll grant you that monarchy is better than dictatorship, but I mean,
it's look what happened. It's it was both. It's the
but
fact
monarchy
that
also gave birth to democracy.
Not really. It's that's and by the way, once we started with those democracies, we kept Christianity around, but what happened? The 20th century happened. It's this thing was a shit show, and we continued with
entirely kept Christianity around, not in the same way.
The Catholic Church is still 1.3 billion people, but
America was more of a Protestant experiment, way more than I mean,
that one actually is historically debatable because it was Protestants who started it, but because of the mass immigration of Catholics, from the rest of Europe, you actually had a very substantial, the Catholic population grew faster than the Protestant population quite a lot, through most of history. And this is where we had a lot of power struggles come from. This is why when they said, the Irish are not welcome, it's this is why. It's because they were all Catholic, and that's when that also ditto the Italians. That's why they say, oh, they're not real whites. And, the Irish are not real whites. The reason why is they're Catholic, and they're coming into Anglo, waspy America, and so you actually had a large immigration population of Catholics coming in basically the entire time, and there was always a notorious power struggle, not to mention down in South and Central America, which was 100% Catholic basically the entire time. So it's even right there in America, it's a mixed bag. It's not all Protestants, it's not all Catholics, it's a mixed bag. And to the extent that the Protestants have been in charge, well, okay, you get some real problems there. And we get one Catholic in, and it's well, and he's I was going to say Joe Biden. Basically, the one Catholic got in there. It's all right, we want to curtail the Fed, we want to end the CIA. We're not going to have bad bit. We're not going to be trying to provoke a war with Cuba.
Yeah, bring the troops home and all that.
It's okay, how'd that work out? And but now we have another Catholic in there, Joe Biden. He's destroying the Protestant work ethic through through all this welfareism, and that's wonderful.
He might really be the Antichrist.
Anyway, it's when you see the real progress happening, it was both the combination of monarchy and Catholicism, Christianity that really did it. And this is when property rights themselves were invented. This is when all of the science, every last one of the sciences was founded by a Catholic monk or a Catholic priest, one of the two. And it's every single last one of them was,
it wasn't pure monarchy, state control of everything. There were, there was an invention of a free market of sorts, and an invention of common law and restrictions that were put on the monarchy.
Yeah, those all were invented under monarchy, and it's all of that stuff came around because you had a monarchical system of government that incentivized it, for better or worse. And
I guess part of the part of the
And
problem I
like
hear
even
just
like
be
with
defining monarchical government, because I think, and I might be guilty of this, is defining monarchy and not giving enough of a distinguishing definition that sets it apart from just a dictatorship. And,
yeah,
and that's sort of probably a American and Protestant.
the difference is a conception of the ownership of the state. Whereas like a dictator, he's only dictator as long as he stays alive. The moment somebody kills him, it's like that guy's now in charge. The guy who kills him is in charge, and you saw this all throughout the East.
So the monarch is still subservient to something above him in a
Well,
sense.
it's not simply that. It's that you can't just kill the monarch and take over. It's like you don't have a right to that. And so it's like maybe you can come in and be a tyrant and force, but people are going to resist you because they perceive you as illegitimate. And it's like you can't just kill your way into power. And so like we're not going to accept you. And that's the difference between dictatorship, like the Roman style dictatorship you had in Constantinople, where it's like we had the reason Constantinople really fell was that you had 800 years of really dictators ruling with an ultra high time preference for power, because the moment because like the way you got the job was killing the other guys who wanted the job. And it's like whereas like the in the West, where you had like King Clovis starting around 450 and his sons, it's like you can't just kill King Clovis and take the power for yourselves. The Catholic Church is not going to, we don't accept you. Like the people are going to
Right,
reject you. They're
but
going
in
to
a
rebel.
sense,
And you actually
that
saw
was
this.
a check against the monarchical powers. They weren't like the ultimate sovereign in that in that
Yes and
framework.
no. It's also, I mean, it's also that, hey, it's like there's a real ownership there. And whereas you never had that in the East, whereas like the guy who's in charge is not literally the owner. He can't pass it down to his kids unless he has the physical power to do
Right.
so.
Yeah.
Whereas like in the West, you actually had that, and that's what gives you the low time preference, that is, what gives you that prosperity, because you can defer gratification into the future. You can have lower taxes. You can have fewer wars. You can, by the way, it's like after the war is over, you actually pay down your debt. Imagine if you can even imagine that. It's like that, taxes never got above 10%. But the reason why, oh, by the way, the reason in the 7th century when Islam spreading across the North Africa, the reason why it spread so quickly is that it came with a massive tax cut. Islam said that hey, 3% is the most.
You ever look at the tax rates that the colonists revolted against? I mean,
right?
can we go back to that, please?
Under Rome it was like 30. So it's like we will fight you to the death, and because we believe in God. Oh, and the enemy's like, oh, by the way, if you accept Allah, we're going to cut your taxes by like 97%. It's like, well, Allahu Akbar, why did you say so? it's like, well, it's like, that sounds fantastic. That's why it really spread. It was that you got, that if you adopted the new religion, you got like a 97% tax cut. That sounds fantastic. Absolutely. Come on in. This Allah guy sounds great. And that was why that happened. But you only have to
That's why, like, I know your idea is more of like sort of privatized, decentralized monarchy, and that competition element.
It's the Holy Roman Empire. If you ever looked at a map of the Holy Roman Empire, it's like hundreds and hundreds of little tiny monarchies, because that's actually how that actually plays out. When you look at the incentive structure, is that you will see some sort of decentralization of power kind of naturally. And it's only when you get the only reason that really wonderful system ended. And by the way, like what would happen is if you got a really bad king, what would happen is people would just move to the next guy, because they live pretty close. That border's really close by, and they'll just move to the other guy. So it prevents really bad people from, consolidating power. The only reason that it ended up consolidating into Prussia and then Germany is thanks to Napoleon. So we have the republics to thank for that. It's like that was what decided that got all of these petty feuding monarchs to.
Wait. We haven't triggered the left enough yet. So what you're saying is the only way to have open borders is to go full monarchy.
Basically, yeah. It's like, that was actually what happened. Is that whenever you had one monarch that tried to raise taxes too high, people just moved next door, and and you actually had a lot fewer wars that way as well, because how did you consolidate power as a king? Well, the way you did it was, you married the daughter of the guy next door, and
And so you're saying, so like the reason why
well,
there
think
was
it,
a
well,
increase, like,
not just yet. Let me finish this. So basically, for every single king, his wife and his daughter and his kid, his wife and his mother were basically all foreigners. So it's like his mother was a foreigner. She came from a different place, so his dad could consolidate power, and his wife is a foreigner. She came from somewhere else, so he could consolidate power. So it's like you actually have a supranational national entity right there, which is, that's kind of what a corporation approximates. Because you have shareholders that are from literally everywhere. And the first problem any corporation is going to have, like I say, a corporate state is going to have when they try to go to war is like, am I going to be bombing my shareholders? It's like they're not going to like that very much, and so that an approximate, a corporation really is the incentive structure of monarchy. We just don't call it that, and your shareholders are your royal family, which are a supranational body, by nature, and whereas your regent of the monarchy, that's your C-suite, and your because the court the kings usually don't do the governing and the day-to-day all that themselves. They have servants and regents for that, ministers. That's your C-suite, and then your customers are your peasants. That's your system of monarchy. That's the corporate body right there.
The way you describe it's almost like you're describing a quasi Rothbardian Hoppian system of
It really is a
competing
property-based
micro
system.
localized governments that are essentially privately created and owned.
Mm-hmm.
But you're putting an overlay of Christian monarchy on
I,
top of it.
well, no, it's that I have different fundamental presuppositions about how reality works, and they logically lead to something like this. And libertarianism, it does look really good. It gets close, but it's like some of the things it does, it gets actually completely wrong, and those matter. And that's why this is why my famous archetropism argument, is I use it to demonstrate how even if you had like Ancapistan, it would naturally consolidate itself into Monarchistan, Moncapistan.
Well,
You
yeah, I
know,
mean the idea that a
the,
truly anarchist society would just result in like no consolidations of people into different little
the idea there isn't a
areas.
demand for power.
Yeah,
It's like
like there's yeah, and that is the
like
part of
you,
your
you need
archetropism theory that I think makes the most sense,
you,
and
what you
libertarians have the
need is
hardest time
what you need
contending
is two
with.
different price systems for controlling the demand for power, because there's actually two demand functions for power. One is at the bottom at the pleb level, the other is at the top at the shareholder level. And you need two of them because there's two different systems. Only a corporation does that through one, low prices, for services to the people, because if it raises prices too much, the other guy is going to outcompete them. And the other one is at the share price for the shareholders, because if they do a really bad job, these are fucking leftists, the share price is going to drop.
I would say Rothbard and Hoppe got this right. I mean, they say the reason why.
They never talk about corporations though, because that really is a monarchy. It's all one guy in control. And also because of nominalism, they think corporations don't exist. It's like those are actually not real entities. They're not that's something that is state created. And in a libertarian free market, you're only going to have personal liability because the person is the only actual thing that exists. Whereas a corporation is like a fictitious entity that is purely derived by the state and would not exist in a free market due to nominalism, because that's the only way these things can actually exist. The all that actually exists is the material individual humans, which are actually unconnected. Whereas under Platonic realism, actually these are a one single body united through their incentives, and so they actually can do this. They actually can limit their own liability this way. They actually can form these incentive structures that create this. And it's because I'm coming at it from a very different presuppositions about how reality in fact works than Rothbard and Hoppe is. And that's the real reason why I'm getting different answers than them. It's not simply cosmetic. it's not, I can't go from, their ideas of materialism and nominalism to what I actually believe in. It's like there's a logical disconnect there.
Well, I
So
agree. I mean, that's why I don't get my libertarianism strictly from Rothbard and Hoppe. I mean, I try to get, and I know you'll still disagree with me at the end of all this, like, but I do try to pull my libertarianism from what the Bible says, and I use Rothbard and Hoppe to
yeah.
supplement that. They had good insights, but I would not. I'm a Christian first and foremost, and I want to be biblical first and foremost. The libertarian or the anarchist part,
Capital C Christian, lowercase l libertarian.
Yeah, but I think that is I think that is a compatible, compatible is not the right word. I think that it is a logically consistent worldview, even if you would say that maybe it's, I don't know, I guess like
it depends on
I think it's similar to where you're coming from, but it's emphasizing different. I think like I have a scope where I seek to emphasize the prudential aspects of like rights and government and enforcement more, and you're kind of coming at it from more of a
the point
what is like what exists and sort of this whole cohesive tapestry of explaining reality from the top down.
Well, what I'm saying is we have two different competing versions of property rights. These are not the same. It's like when we say the word the phrase property rights, this is not a one-to-one thing. Like it can refer to multiple different systems. It can even refer to like a communist system where it's all public property. It's like this idea of property rights doesn't tell you what that actually consists of. And it depends on your presuppositions about how these things, what this phrase property rights actually consists of. And what I'm saying is we have two different competing systems here between libertarianism and Christianity. And, it makes a very big difference, how you structure those things, what they're founded upon, because you get very different conclusions. Like
I would agree. I think if you take pure secular libertarianism and you just start with self-ownership, that's how you get insane conclusions like Rothbard saying you can abandon your children and
you can abort the baby if you want. If you want to,
exactly.
Like because like the mother has a title to her own body. She cannot transfer that to the baby, even if the baby is inside her womb. Even if the baby has because like the baby has no right to be there because she cannot transfer the title to her body to the baby.
And that's how you get the idea of trans children. And the idea, because they're like, hey, listen, children are self-owners. They have complete autonomy. And so I was getting into arguments with a lot of the left libertarians in the last month or so, because I was like, no, children don't have full autonomy. Like, that's stupid. Like, who believes that children are completely autonomous?
Or that, like, you get, like, the arguments with Ace, where he's like, the parent may, prevent the child from having sex with a pedophile, but the child would have the right to resist his parents.
Yeah,
it's like, you are fucking retarded, buddy.
If libertarianism is that, I want no part of it. But
that's consistent. It's like the worst part about Ace is how truly consistent it is. He's really like that's like the one guy who's like probably read Kant since Rothbard and Hoppe. I think Kinsella is probably read Kant as well.
It's consistent. It's just freaking evil.
Well, this is not reality. It's like this is not compatible with Christianity, and so it's like you can't say, oh, the kid has a right to have sex with the adult pedophile, with the 30-year-old adult pedophile. It's like no. So it's like
no, the
no
child's not. I think even in a material sense, you would say like the child's not fully developed, and I just don't think you can make a claim to, like, if someone's not fully developed, they can't be fully autonomous. Like,
no, of course not. And that's the but it's like even then it's like you're assuming that there's no positive duty going both ways. You know what I mean? It's like the child has an obligation to be productive for like basically his entire adult life. And so that he can be able to take care of his parents when they get older. It's like that natural circle of life that, the parents take care of the child when the child is young and needs to be taken care of. And, in the circle of life and when they finish, when their parents are retiring, they're too old to work now and yet they're still alive. Someone needs to take care of them. That duty naturally falls to their children. And there's a natural circle of life there that you know that the children have that each the parent and the child is having reciprocal responsibility to observe. It's not just like, oh, they can choose not to. No, 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 no. They it's like
Well,
those are enforceable duties
well,
that they.
and you need this sort of cultural cohesion and that sort of stability, and that you need those positive
Yeah,
obligations
I mean,
for society to function and to continue. And this is why I
not have utter
believe,
chaos.
like, libertarianism, if it was fully embraced, would either lead to the destruction of society or would lead to a completely Christian society, because the Christian incentives and positive obligations are the only ones
Would
that could make libertarianism work.
You're going to have the Christians owning everything.
Yeah.
It's like either basically either it's such a shit show that the communists are owning everything because the people are seeing this chaos and they're crying out, please just give us a leader, anybody to put this shit down. It's like because again they want a government. It's like give unto us a king. It's like they want the government. They want that dictatorship. That's why all republics, all democracies always end in dictatorship every time, no exceptions. Some do it faster than others, and some do it slower than others. But every single time, same result, because the people want it. And the question is that one guy who finally comes, is he going to be like a whack job Stalin, or or Hitler, or is he going to be like Richard the Lionheart? It's like we could really hope it's like Richard the Lionheart or Charlemagne. It's like that would be wonderful, but like we haven't gotten that lucky recently. It's been Stalin and Hitler. It's these these or even worse is like not okay, maybe not worse, but like it could be FDR or Lincoln. It's like these guys are pretty bad. It's like even like the good ones are still pretty bad. It's like we we have to say hey, if this libertarianist thing really gets it gets going, if the chaos really gets going, people will demand a dictator come in to put that shit down, and they always do every
or
time.
heroes will rise and lead people into better ways of leaders will rise and lead people into in the Christian sense. I mean, I think of this in like the Tolkienian sense. I mean, it's what Tolkien thought. He thought that he was sort of someone who said I lean towards anarchy, but also he was like, but from anarchy, monarchs kind of rise up and lead people towards
Yeah, I mean
a
when
better
Rome was
society.
when Rome was falling and this thing's a shit show, and it's like the republic can no longer truly, oh, it's not even a republic anymore, it's now a dictatorship and an empire. The dictators can't even consolidate power outside of Rome anymore. So this is when King Clovis marches in with his army, and that guy was also a fucked up character, but he was still a monarch, and his family was awful, but it was still better than the alternative. And because the alternative was like Roman dictatorship, and we know how that's been working out. It's been a real shit show. And this Clovis guy comes in, and the popes and a few cardinals get together, like, okay, how can we make this work? Okay, we've been invaded. What do we do? And we see that there's this hot princess over here named Clotilda. We're going to marry her to Clovis. She's going to convert him to Catholicism, and somehow this actually worked. It's like this is how we got the first Catholic monarch. Is that the popes, the Pope and the cardinals all schemed together to try to marry Clovis off to some hot chick.
So what leads to European monarchs just constantly warring with each other? Is it all Protestantism's fault, or
they really didn't? It's like that. It wasn't until you really started to get the like what happened was at the end of like the 14th century. What happened was the popes had consolidated so much power that they were like routinely deposing monarchs they didn't like. And the monarchs didn't like that. It's like they didn't like that the popes were just outclassing them over and over and over again, just completely monopolizing all power. And so that was kind of a problem. And so they're like, all right, we need a new system where the Pope isn't in charge. Oh, look, here's this Martin Luther guy saying we don't have to give a shit about him. Let's fund this guy. And what you find with all the Protestant reformers, every last one of them was funded by the state. And like every single one of them, they had a bunch of state and backers amongst the nobility who were sick and tired of the popes bossing them around. And because the popes were just master politicians, and they had been for like a millennia at that point. So
And then after that, everything with Protestantism went wonderfully well.
yeah, I mean, we had a wonderful happy ending in the 20th century where we almost nuked ourselves into oblivion. It's just like I mean, it didn't work out great, but it's like the alternative was much worse. It's like it wasn't a perfect system, but like my God, it was so much better. It's like this was when the kings started to go to war with each other, but because some of these kings really liked to have they knew they had the popes at their back, and the other guys were like, I don't really have the pope at my back, and I don't feel comfortable having you guys around. It's like I feel like I'm surrounded by my enemies, and this is when you started to get a lot more European wars, and so it really was because that unfortunately it was a system that kind of worked a little bit too well, where the popes ended up consolidating up quite a lot of political power. And I mean, you had a one famous story where in like the 12th century, where I take it back, 11th century, where there was a king who, a Holy Roman Emperor who didn't really like the Pope, and it's like, I don't think you're legitimate. I don't think you were the real one that was elected. And I kind of view it as my job to make sure we're going with the real guy, with the real Pope, who is like this guy over here that I nominated, obviously. And then I think his name was, I think it was one of the Pope Urbans. I forget the name of the actual Pope, but he goes and says like, all right, fuck you. You're not the Holy Roman Emperor anymore, and I am freeing all of your nobles from having to give a shit about what you think. And like within a year, the guy was deposed, and he had to, and like like everybody went into rebellion. No pleb, wanted to pay his taxes to this Holy Roman Emperor, and there was nothing he could do about it. Like, and so what he ended up having to do was, like physically crawl over by him, almost by himself and a few of his servants over the Alps during winter to go beg the Pope at the doorstep of the Pope's mistress, where the Pope had been staying. Oops. It's supposed to be celibates, but the Pope had a mistress, and the king and the emperor knew it, went and begged at her doorstep for 3 days, during the ice cold winter, for the Pope to forgive him. And eventually the Pope did. And it's like, all right, and by forgive, I mean, you're going to be my bitch right now and kiss the ring. It's like, this is what happened. And this is like a famous story of, if you want to go on YouTube, look for the Kings and Generals, or it might be History March channel. It's like why this king had to crawl over the Alps is the name of the video. Hilarious story of a monarch getting his ass handed to him by the Christians. And anyway, but that was kind of what that started that set a precedent, and monarchs didn't really want to cross the Pope from there on out. And the few that did, same thing happened. And this is what eventually started the Protestant Reformation, where the kings and nobles were looking for a way to not have to deal with the popes. Enter Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Ulrich Zwingli. And eventually, the really secular ones like Robespierre. And those are the real crazies at the French Revolution. Those are also Protestant reformers. And
although we got the guillotine out of it, which is
I mean, the reformers kept reforming the church until they reformed Christ right out of it.
Yeah.
So it's like the moment you reject authority, it's like, well, okay, then they can reject you, and then reject you, and then reject you, and then reject you.
And this is where I think there's a nice yin yang to this conversation, because it's like I think what I would say to you is that your sort of vision of monarchy needs the tension and the pull of libertarianism to say, like, listen, this stuff isn't going to work if you centralize power too much and you get too big. You need to really value markets and decentralization and competition. And with libertarianism, now conversely, the tension you're putting on my system is like, you need to respect authority. You need to be okay with people consolidating some power and acting, in ways that you might go, oh no, that looks too much like a state, or looks too much like someone ruling over other people. It's like, well, sometimes that's what people want, is to kind of be ruled over, and that might, like, if you give people the ability to consent to things, it's like, they'll consent to
you know, if
collectivizing
you
together under people, and it is in a way division of labor, like you said,
yeah,
specialization.
I mean the dirty little secret about consent ethics is people will consent to quite a lot of evil. I mean, Hitler won his election every election he was in, and not by having to be the guy counting the votes. Like he didn't have to. It's like he won basically fair and square because the Weimar Republic had been such a shit show, and because of all these consent ethics and all this degeneracy that was running around. I mean, the place was a nightmare, and it's like Hitler won fair and square, which is like the worst part of it. Is that he's not like Stalin, where Stalin's like the only one that actually counts is the guy counting the votes. It's like that guy cheated. It's like Stalin and Lenin, like they killed their way into power.
I think we can blame that more on democracy though than we can libertarianism.
It's like yes, the problem is that the moment you allow people consent-based ethics, it's like they'll consent to quite a lot of evil, and that has consequences like Hitler. It's like back in Weimar, they had like transgenderism, they had child prostitution, they had all kinds of fucked up shit.
Libertarianism is at best a razor thin philosophy that should never be considered to be a whole ethical framework to organize society around.
That's the problem, is that there's no such thing as a thin ethical framework, as I kind of mentioned, is that hey, this thing has philosophical presuppositions loaded into it that are very, very thick. It's like materialism right there. Like materialism is its own religion. Like that is a religious presupposition right there, that God doesn't exist, or that all that exists is whatever physics can tell us exists. That is a theological presupposition right there that has very real consequences. It's like if that's not there, libertarianism is very different. It looks very different.
Right. So libertarianism is sort of a supplement, and
not even a supplement. It's its own religion. It is its own. It is its own. All political ideologies, not just libertarianism, are their own religion. They all have religious presuppositions built into them at the philosophical layer. And it's like, what you see as libertarianism is like the final conclusions of all of these philosophies being weaved together, all of these theological presuppositions being weaved together. It's like, and like we don't tend to think of it this way, which, by the way, is also a product of Protestantism. Dividing, again, Kant's ideology right there, where he puts up a wall between reason and politics and religion over here. This is why we get this idea that libertarianism could be a thin ideology.
I think our politics should be informed by our religion. I think religion should.
Well, I
think religion should touch every aspect of society and our lives. I have to wave a red flag when it comes to like, listen, what we can't do is use our Christianity, pick up that sword, and say, "Sinner, stop sinning," at the point of the sword.
Yeah,
that is my. I call that libertarianism. If you want to call that something else, that's I guess a semantic battle that we'll have to.
Well, I mean, you can say. I mean, we do actually do that though. Like we say, no murder, no rape, no theft. It's like the high priority items are the ones we do that for because resources are scarce and we have to prioritize. That's the law of demand, or the law of returns.
I think there's biblical. This might be for another episode. I do think there are biblical teachings that I don't think Catholicism would scoff at in terms of looking at sinners and saying, listen, stop sinning, but also you leave them to go on their way sinning if they don't stop sinning.
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas, used the prostitution example that I always use, that, hey, if you ban this, it's actually going to make it worse, and so it's probably better just regulate them. His suggestion was basically a red light district. Like you shove them off at the edge of the there's like you cordon them off in one little bad part of town, and it's a red light district. And
if you take away the state as we have it today, and the state's funding and supporting of these sorts of sinful behaviors and degeneracies, I'm not saying they disappear, but I don't think they sort of naturally do seclude themselves to the corners of society much more than we have in today's society, where it's blasted into public schools and blasted over the media. The left controls the state and all of the state hybrid institutions that are,
Yeah.
it's called Twitter and social media companies are called it's a private company, bro. It's like, yeah, but is it really? Like,
Well, I mean, technically, prostitution is entirely legal in America as long as you film it and distribute it for money.
right.
It's like, well, it's like, and they don't get any tax benefits. I mean, they don't really have like trademarks on this shits. There's no trademark on the Pornhub. It's like maybe the Pornhub itself is a trademark, but I'm not going there because I love the logo. I'm going there because there's like, there's like some woman spreading her legs and all that. That's the reason they're going there. None of that is subsidized. None of that has any preferential tax treatment.
Well, no, it's indirectly subsidized.
80% of the internet. I mean, porn is 80% of the internet. This is not like, I mean, it's not really cordoned off. It's doing quite well. And turns out people really want it. And it's a...
yeah, but how would you, I mean, like, even if, because I could argue that
I would tax
there's
the
a lot
advertisers. If you want to do something about it, tax the advertisers. That's where the money's coming in. That's the real funding. The private funding for this is coming from ad revenue. I would just put a tax on that. And hey, if you want less of something, put a tax on it. And you don't. And right now, the IRS is going after like middle class people. We could retax them to go after porn, which they're probably watching porn to work anyway. They're the government. You know what I mean?
I think the other thing though is that the state and its interventions creates the demographic of people who then go into the porn industry because of things like broken families and things like that, and incentivize.
You didn't have that in monarchy. You did not have that under monarchy. It's like you had you had tight knit together families who all lived in like
that sometimes
high geographic proximity.
Though I mean, like you look at like the Bible. I mean, they definitely the monarchy there incentivized a lot of the debauchery and things like that. So I mean,
compared to like the republics. It's like you have to take these.
No, yeah, I mean compared to what? Like, I listen, monarchy is better than democracy and republics like all day long. Like, you'll get no disagreement from me there. It's just
compared to the anarchy that preceded it, the monarchies were a lot more stable, a lot more happy. They never had that really invasion problem again until the Babylonians rolled through, and then it became a problem. And then
there was a long period of I mean there were problems in the anarchy, but there were also long periods where there really weren't problems and people were living at peace. So I mean,
it ended up getting so bad to the point they're like, just give us a king. We can't do this. We can't do this.
But what got bad was because it wasn't because of the anarchy. It was because of the sin. It was because
there's no enforcement mechanism there. There's no there's no real enforcement mechanism.
But then we see later that the enforcement mechanism leads them into their sin, and that I don't know. It's
only 2/3 of the time, which is still a much better batting average. You know what I mean? It's like
I don't know. I'd be willing to bet that they were a lot closer than what I think you're. I think that it's. I think sin in some ways, just like
it's non-existence. It leads to serfdom and slavery and death. Yeah, and it necessarily so because it's non-existence. And it's like you had like 21, I think, kings in the Old Testament. 14 of them were awful, and 7 pretty good. And so it's like a 1/3 batting average on them. And unfortunately, all 7 were in the Southern Kingdom, and the Northern Kingdom was absolutely terrible because the Southern Kingdom was the legitimate kings, so half of them were okay, and the Northern kings were chosen by the people who always suck at choosing leaders, and so they got wiped out by the Assyrians, and they're not there anymore, and so it's like eventually you got really bad kings down in Judah too, and then they got wiped out by the Babylonians, and they're the only ones that came back after the Babylonian captivity, only to get conquered by Alexander the Great, the Nephilim. It's like, and then they managed to. He died early, shocker. That's like the way all the other Nephilim died early. And then his generals took over, and they didn't, they weren't able to really consolidate power. So, what did the Jews do? They made a really good allies in the Roman Republic, who came to help them fight off their oppressors, and then never left.
Yeah.
And then we get to the New Testament, and then they get wiped out. So was like the system. You know, you get like Herod and all them. You know, it's like you started off with a really bad, really bad dude who's like killing all the firstborns. You know, it's like, oof. You know, it's like, as again, this is it's not a perfect system, but once you get like Christian monarchy, it actually starts working out really well. It's like you started off with barbarians like King Clovis, who would like kill, like burn to death his, his like brother-in-law and all that, who like trying to compete with him to the throne, and eventually you get to like Charlemagne and Pepin the Great, who are like really real defenders of Christianity, really moral and pious men for all of their many faults. And yes, but they were still better than the dictators in Constantinople. It's like what's his face? Charlemagne couldn't even read, and but like and he was has real bad moves. Like his heart was in the right place. Whenever he had whenever there was a rebellion in Germany, it rarely did not start with like the burning of a church. So Charlemagne had the wonderful idea that, what if I just forced all of them to convert to Christianity and and just forcibly baptized all of them. Then the Holy Spirit would come down, and they would, and everything would be peaceful. And we had to explain to him, no, that doesn't actually work that way. They actually have to choose it and all that. And he's like, really? It's like choice is a thing here. Never occurred to him that like personal choice might be a factor. Like this was like the kind of guy that we chose over the dictatorship in Constantinople. It's like this is the guy. It's like this is the better alternative, and we still managed to turn them into.
Charlemagne, we are not Islam.
Yeah, it's like we still managed to turn them into like much better guys, than the who were like the lords and ladies of legend, and who were much more moral and actually, they like the first, so like what was Charlemagne's response to when we told him, oh, this consent thing really matters? He's like, so let me try. So let me just do a public education campaign where we're going to educate all of the priests on the Nicene Creed and the Lord's Prayer to make sure we're all on the same page, because we weren't actually all on the same page. And so you had the first public education campaign in human history, empire-wide, which is all of Europe at that point. The entire European continent was ruled by Charlemagne. And so what happened? It's like let's try this whole civilization thing where we try civilizing the barbarians and teaching them Christianity. Turned out it worked really well. And
right, but the final point, because I got to go here. The final point I make is like what you're describing was done without the sword. They didn't use the sword to make people more Christian. They used,
it was taxpayer funded, so like they technically did. It's like it was a public education campaign in the truest sense of the word. It was the first one of a kind. Before that, no one ever thought, well, why should we educate plebs? This was the first time that was ever done, because the priests were all plebs, and not a lot of them couldn't even read. They usually could, but not always. And so we had to teach them that, then teach them the creed, then teach them the Lord's Prayer, and all that. It was the first of a kind. And
what were the tax rate? I mean, I'd want to see what the tax rates were.
Less than 10%. It's like
we're talking low, low. I mean,
very nice compared to today.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like, again, the taxes were always lower, because if you tried to raise them too much, you got rebellions. When the war was over, because of the rebellion, the king actually paid down his debt instead of taking out way more loans.
Yeah, there was no fiat currency system. They couldn't just,
hard money. Yeah, it's like it was a pretty good. It's like if you go down the checklist, by the way, invented private property, invented all of the scientists, every last scientific discipline, invented modern civilization basically as we know it. And it's like, this was a really good working system that we've kind of been running on the fumes of. And, now that you took the monarchy and the good incentives away, now we're having all of that technology we invented is now like a new surrounding.
Brave new world, here we come.
Yeah, exactly. Now it's all being used for evil, and it's fucking terrifying. It's like this didn't happen. It's like, remember that, that road sign that had George Bush on it said, "Miss me yet?" There needs to be one with like the Catholic monarchs with Charlemagne's face on, like, "Miss me yet?" It's like, yeah, I do. Those guys are better. It was a much better system, and it was like it worked fantastically well because it was the natural order, as it basically as it should be. You needed a few minor you needed that second price system. You only had the one price system down at the bottom at the taxation level. That's fees fees you pay for statecraft services, whether you want to or not. It's like we only had the one price system for power down at the bottom. We needed that second one up at the top. For the shareholder level, we didn't have that, and because of that, you get incompetent kings who don't know how to consolidate power and don't know how to recognize true religion and see that the big hey, if I fund all of this heresy and error, it's going to backfire on me stupendously because I ended up funding all of the guys who gave the moral justification for the rebels to overthrow my ass. It's like that was what happened. It's like they didn't quite think it through all the way, and because they're not very good, thinkers, they're not very good not good at consolidating power, which requires you to know the truth. And so if you can't do that, you're going to get overthrown, which is the downfall of the system. Oops. So, but you need that second price system at the top to stop that from happening. So that's why I say corporate monarchical statecraft is really the solution. It was the fully fleshed out monarchical system that doesn't have that scalability problem. Oops.
Well, let's see if we can end on a point of agreement here. I would say Brave New World is the better and more accurate dystopian novel if you compare it to 1984, which is the one people love to quote.
Yeah, I would say it's a false choice because the That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis nails it. It nails exactly where we are right now in reality, because that is the only one that presumes demons are behind all of this.
Yeah, but there's something about the part in Brave New World where they're conditioning children to have sexual experiences and to not be ashamed of them that really fits with our current trajectory.
That one is that one. C.S. Lewis wasn't quite that imaginative, but you did get the transhumanism that was behind all of it. So,
cool.
Anyway, great talking with you.
Yeah, you too, man. So
I hope I've given you a lot to think about where these things actually come from, where these differences actually are. Because I think when you meditate on this long enough, you end up changing your Twitter handle to biblical monarchy.
I don't know. Some of it to me is a bit semantical, but I'm a lot closer to you in terms of the end stuff than I am on the exact presuppositional stuff. But
I think you're right there with me on the presuppositional stuff. You're trying to figure out how can I still get the old libertarianism through the Christian system, and I'm telling you right now, it's not going to work. You can keep trying, but eventually you're going to give up, and you're going to I never had a point. And particularly with the more you see like when you see nominalism in play, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you see the more and more you see it, you're like, ooh, this doesn't work at all. That's like, this is really
it has to. To me, it has to work with Christianity. It can't work if you have pure libertarianism. It's a hellhole.
That's the thing. It's like nominalism is intrinsic to a lot of conclusions of libertarianism. It's like you do not get the same system of property rights, the same conclusions of libertarianism without nominalism. It has to be there, or many different.
I mean, there's parts of what I would call Christian libertarianism. I think doesn't have some of those same baggages as
intellectual property.
Pure libertarianism has.
Yeah.
Like for example, I'm not as anti-corporate. I don't think.
Corporations exist? Do they not? Does intellectual property exist? Does it not? Does your reputation exist in a scarce way, or does it not? Is there a right to sin? Is there not? These are all human actions equally the same?
It's really the right to sin part where we have the biggest disagreement, and I'll have to continue to. I'll continue to contemplate on your arguments there, but that's the
one. 2 podcasts in the description is where I think I think once you get through it, it's like it's tough not to stop seeing it. So
well, I'll give them a listen. But thanks, man. This was a lot of fun. I hope you and your family are doing well. That little one.
The baby's as big as the government now.
Yeah,
he's going so fast. 99th percentile height, weight, head size, and he's already crawling too. and
Our
it's not
our
even six,
our baby
not
is
even 6 months yet.
our baby is off the charts, like beyond the 99th percentile in
Yeah.
height.
Kind of, he's going like the federal government.
Oh, like that's because he never gets off the boob. His two
Yeah,
modes
right?
are sleeping, wake
It's
up,
the breast milk.
breast milk.
Yeah, it's the breast milk. I guarantee it. It's like that formula. Those babies are much tinier. And
Yeah.
anyway, great talking with you, buddy.
Yep, you too, man. Take it easy.